There is a certain kind of story that is easier to listen to in the dark. Not because it is filled with screams and sudden shocks, but because it moves slowly, like a distant campfire on the horizon, glowing quietly while the rest of the world falls asleep. The story of Genghis Khan's empire is one of those tales. You have probably heard his name before, maybe in school, maybe in a documentary, as the great conqueror who rose from the cold grasslands of Mongolia to build the largest land empire the world has ever seen. But behind the familiar headlines of genius, strategy, and unstoppable cavalry, there are parts of this story that stay in the shadows, half whispered, half forgotten. Tonight, we are going to walk through those shadows together. Genghis Khan is often described as a force of nature, like a storm that no one could stop. The usual story is simple and almost comforting in its clarity. A brilliant leader unifies the tribes, defeats his enemies, and creates order where there was chaos. There is a strange satisfaction in that narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It suggests that everything, even violence on a massive scale, followed a kind of logic that historians can map and explain. Yet, when you look a little closer, the lines are not so clean. The empire did not rise only on disciplined tactics and clever diplomacy. It also rose on fear so deep that cities chose to surrender rather than risk being wiped from the map. It rose on internal betrayals, on family tensions carefully buried under heroic legends, on laws that were sometimes written down and sometimes kept deliberately secret. It rose on the quiet suffering of people whose names never appeared in chronicles, but whose lives were uprooted, moved, and used as raw material for a great imperial machine. Imagine yourself lying down, eyes gently closed, while the scene shifts from your room to a wide, cold steppe under a sky sprinkled with stars. The air is thin and sharp. You can almost hear hooves in the distance, not in a wild charge, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Somewhere out there, in a darkened felt tent, sits a leader who once was a boy named Temujin, abandoned with his family and forced to learn that mercy could be fatal. From that lonely beginning, he will become the figure we know as Genghis Khan, the Great Khan, the man whose decisions will echo from China to Europe. Our journey will move gently between the grand visible events and the quieter secrets that shaped them. The brutal cleansing of rival clans on the steppe, the destruction of cities that chose the wrong side, the legal code that held everything together while remaining partially hidden from the people it ruled. We will look at the way terror was used not as random cruelty, but as a tool, calculated and sharpened. We will listen to the tensions inside his own family, where questions about bloodlines and legitimacy could decide the fate of continents. We will pause with the unnamed captives marched across deserts and mountains so their skills could serve a ruler they had never chosen. All of this we will do at a slow, steady pace, without rushing, without shouting, in a tone meant for someone who is tired, maybe restless, but still curious. The aim is not to turn this story into a nightmare, nor to clean it up and make it comfortable. It is to let the darker details emerge calmly, one by one, and to hold them up to the faint light of reflection. Some parts are well supported by historical records, others are stitched from chronicles that mixed fact, gossip, and political agenda. Some episodes sit on the border between history and legend, where even experts disagree. Whenever that happens, we will treat those stories as possibilities, not certainties, and you can simply let them drift by like clouds passing over the moon. As you listen, you may notice something interesting. The secrets of Genghis Khan's empire are not only about what he did to his enemies, they are also about what he did to his own people, to his own sons, and to his own memory. They show how an empire can be both efficient and fragile, both orderly and built on constant fear. They remind us that power, when it grows too large, often needs silence and erasure as much as it needs banners and battle cries. To understand how such a vast structure of fear and loyalty was born, we have to step back from the image of the Great Khan as a fully formed legend and return to a much smaller picture. A boy on the steppe whose world has just broken apart and who is about to learn that survival sometimes demands choices the official stories will never fully admit. Before there was an emperor whose name could silence a room, there was a boy who discovered, far too young, that the world could simply walk away from you. Temujin was born into a noble lineage on the Mongol steppe, the son of a minor chieftain, but nobility in that landscape meant something very different from palaces and silk. It meant duty, the constant tension of rival clans, and a life where safety was always temporary. Around the family fire, he would have heard proud stories about ancestors and about the eternal blue sky that watched over the Mongols. Those evenings must have felt warm and secure. They did not last. The turning point came when his father was poisoned while returning from a journey. One day Temujin still had a protector, flawed but strong, a man whose presence kept enemies cautious and allies loyal. The next day, that protective wall simply vanished. In theory, the clan should have closed ranks around the widow Holan and her children. In practice, they weighed the risk of supporting a leaderless family and decided it was safer to cut their losses. People who had shared meat, milk, and stories with them drifted away with their herds, leaving the small family behind like a forgotten bundle on the grass. Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were suddenly alone on a steppe that had never felt so wide. If you let your imagination settle into that scene, you can almost see them standing in an open landscape where the nearest help is already a fading shape in the distance. The animals they depended on are taken away. The tents are fewer and more fragile. The wind sounds different when you realize no one is coming to rescue you. Holan is forced to become not just a grieving widow, but the central pillar of survival, gathering wild plants, fishing in cold rivers, and turning every scrap of food into a shared meal. For Temujin, this is not a political lesson written in a book. It is a daily physical reminder that loyalty can dissolve the moment it becomes inconvenient. Inside that stripped-down family world, pressure accumulated like weight on a thin branch. Food was scarce, tempers were brittle, and simple disagreements could feel enormous because there was so little to spare. In that tight circle, something happened that formal heroic tales often rush past. Temujin and his half-brother better drifted into a serious conflict. Not over abstract ideals, but over leadership, respect, and the small resources that separated survival from starvation. At some point, the tension crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Temujin killed better, not on an open battlefield surrounded by banners, but in the messy, painful proximity of his own family. It is a detail that many later storytellers preferred to keep in the background, yet it sits at the heart of his formation. Listening to this part of the story in the quiet of your room, it changes the silhouette of the future conqueror. Before he commanded huge armies, he was a teenager who chose a brutal solution inside the most intimate circle he had. This does not prove that he was born cruel, nor does it turn him into a simple villain. It does, however, suggest that his understanding of survival fused early with the idea that some obstacles, even relatives, could and sometimes should be removed. Compromise, in his world at that time, might have looked less like kindness and more like a risk his family could not afford. There were other moments that engraved the same lesson in different shapes. At one point in his youth, Temujin fell into the hands of a rival group who saw him not as a future ruler, but as a potential threat that needed to be controlled. They bound him, humiliated him, and kept him under guard, making it clear that his life could be snuffed out with little ceremony. For a boy who had already watched his clan abandon his mother, being physically restrained by enemies must have deepened his sense that the world was not just dangerous but actively predatory. Eventually he managed to escape, using patience, timing, and the quiet help of someone who decided, for reasons we can only guess, that this prisoner was worth saving. That night escape, slipping away into the open darkness of the steppe, would stay with him as proof that a single break in the chain of control could change everything. All these experiences layered themselves inside him like sheets of cooled metal, hammered again and again by hunger, betrayal, and fear. They shaped a mind that could hold fierce loyalty for a chosen few and pitiless resolve toward those who stood outside that circle. The boy who once wondered whether his family would eat through the winter would later command caravans of wealth. The child who watched his own clan turn their backs would one day make sure that entire clans who defied him left almost no trace at all. These early years do not excuse the destruction that came later, and they do not fully explain it. But they help us understand why mercy might have seemed like a luxury he could not trust. When you hear later about rival groups on the steppe being crushed or erased, it is easy to treat those scenes as cold strategy falling from the mind of a fully formed warlord. In the soft dark where you are now, you can see them instead as the long shadow of these boyhood experiences, stretched across a much larger stage. The empire of Genghis Khan did not begin with polished generals and elaborate plans. It began with a frightened, determined family trying not to disappear, and with a young Temujin slowly deciding that, if the world was that cruel, he would have to become something even more relentless in order to bend it to his will. If Temujin's childhood had carved into him the lesson that no one would save his family, his early adulthood became a long, cold answer to that discovery. The steppe he moved across was not empty. It was a crowded web of tribes and clans, each with its own proud stories, long grudges, and sharply tuned suspicions. To build anything stable out of that shifting world, Temujin would first have to convince the steppe itself to stop arguing with him. His method for doing that was as simple as it was unforgiving. The enemies he faced at this stage were not distant emperors in silk robes. They were neighbors, rivals he knew by name, people who had once shared alliances with his father and then snapped those bonds when they became inconvenient. Some had taken part in his family's abandonment. Others had kidnapped Bert, his young wife, forcing him into one of the most painful campaigns of his life to bring her back. When you hear the names Tatas, Merkit, or Teoshiad in chronicles, they can sound like abstract labels, but for Temujin they were personal echoes of betrayal and humiliation. On the quiet steppe night of your imagination, you can picture fires from different camps glowing on the horizon, each one representing a group that might one day ride either to his rescue or to his destruction. Temujin began to push for something the steppe had rarely seen, not just a shifting coalition, but a durable unity under one central authority. That sounded reassuring when he talked about ending endless raids, stabilizing trade, and protecting families from surprise attacks. Yet underneath the promising language was a hard condition. Unity would be built not on polite meetings, but on decisive victories. Clans that resisted him were not simply defeated. Many were systematically broken apart so that they could never threaten him again. Leaders who refused to bend were removed permanently. Sometimes entire noble lineages were cut off, leaving no natural center around which future resistance could form. For the Tatars, who had been involved in the poisoning of his father, Temujin's response turned into a carefully remembered act of revenge. Accounts from later writers describe large numbers of them being executed or scattered, their identity as a powerful group dissolving into the larger fabric of the new order. When you hear that, you might imagine a single dramatic battle, but the reality was probably slower and more suffocating. Defeat, pursuit, capture, punishment, and redistribution of survivors among loyal followers. It was a cleansing in the political sense, aimed at disinfecting the steppe of any faction that might try to restore the old balance of power. The Merkit, who had stolen Bert, were treated with similar firmness. For Temujin, this was not just about recovering a wife. It was about making sure everyone understood that striking at his family carried a cost that would echo for years. Campaigns against them did not simply grab a few hostages and end with a handshake. They wore down the Merkit across time and distance, until they were no longer a single, coherent force. In a way, the steppe itself became a witness to this slow erasure, watching as banners vanished and familiar clan names stopped appearing in serious negotiations. Yet, even while he dismantled some groups, Temujin was also weaving others into his emerging structure. Many common warriors and families from defeated clans were offered a place under his banner, provided they accepted new loyalties and new discipline. He understood that men who had once ridden against him could, under the right pressure and reward, ride for him instead. The price was steep. They had to let go of their old leaders, their old internal hierarchies, sometimes even their very clan names. What emerged was less a loose confederation and more a single, sharpened tool in his hands. If you slow the story down and listen closely, another layer appears beneath the loud victories. For ordinary people on the steppe, the cleansing of rival clans meant watching familiar patterns vanish. The neighbors you had traded with for generations might suddenly be scattered, absorbed, or annihilated. The songs about proud local chiefs, passed down around fires, could become dangerous to sing. A child growing up in this new order would learn that the map of the steppe was not fixed. It could be rewritten by one man's decisions, and anyone who stood on the wrong side of his will might simply be erased from the story. From a distance, historians later praised Temujin's ability to unify a fractured region. They saw the benefits of a single law, a single chain of command, a single vision strong enough to push beyond the boundaries of Mongolia and into larger empires. But in the hush of your own room, where there is time to consider the cost, you can also feel the chill in that achievement. Unity, in this case, was not the gentle joining of hands. It was a forced, sometimes bloody consolidation that depended on making certain rivals disappear so thoroughly that future generations would know them only as defeated names in someone else's chronicle. This early phase of internal cleansing became the template for how Genghis Khan would later treat cities and kingdoms far beyond the steppe. Those who accepted his authority could survive, sometimes even thrive, under the new order. Those who resisted risked learning that his memory for grievances was long, and his response was seldom half-measured. Before his empire stretched across Asia, before foreign rulers trembled at news of his approach, he had already practiced on people who spoke his language, shared his way of life, and knew his history. The first secrets of his empire's darkness were written not in distant lands, but in the familiar grasslands of his youth, where loyalty had once failed him and where he now demanded that loyalty be absolute. Once the steppe had been forced into a single, harsh kind of harmony, the gaze of Genghis Khan turned outward. The loose world of rival clans gave way to something more structured and wealthy, but also more fragile in its own way. Beyond the grasslands lay cities that seemed almost like another planet to steppe riders. High walls, crowded markets, warehouses filled with goods from half the known world. For the Mongols, these places were tempting and unsettling at the same time. They glowed with opportunity. Yet they also represented a kind of power that did not depend on speed or horses, but on stone, trade, and bureaucracy. The real turning point came with the conflict against the Khwarezmian Empire, a realm that stretched across parts of Central Asia and the Middle East. On paper, it might have become a natural trading partner. Instead, a series of clumsy decisions and deadly insults ignited a conflict that would etch Genghis Khan's name into the memory of cities far from the steppe. A Mongol trade caravan was destroyed. Envoys were treated with contempt, even killed. For a ruler like Genghis, who believed deeply in the safety of messengers and the sanctity of diplomatic contact, this was more than a slight. It was a challenge to his authority and to the very system of movement and communication he was trying to build. What followed is often remembered in numbers, because the human mind struggles to grasp events of this scale in any other way. Chronicles written by observers who lived through the invasions describe cities that once pulsed with life being emptied with terrifying speed. The names of those cities still echo through history: Merv, Nishapur, Herat, and others like them. Each had its own history, its own local heroes, its own humble routines. Each became, for a brief, bleak moment, an example of what happened when a city chose to stand against the Khan and lost. To imagine one of these places in the last days before the Mongols arrived, you can slow the scene down. Picture narrow streets filled with the smell of bread, spices, and animals. Imagine the layered sounds of bargaining, the call to prayer, children playing in dusty courtyards, the quiet work of scribes bent over ledgers. For the people who lived there, history was not an epic story. It was the rhythm of opening a shop in the morning and closing it at night. Then word came that the Mongols were approaching, and the atmosphere changed. Rumors from distant towns raced ahead of the actual armies, describing what had happened elsewhere in tones hushed and strained. When a city decided to resist, it was not a simple, careless choice. Local leaders weighed their pride and their duty against the stories of what surrender might bring. They knew their walls had repelled enemies before. They trusted in numbers, in fortifications, in the sense that stone could outlast horsemen. What many of them did not fully grasp was how far Genghis Khan was willing to go to make resistance look like a mistake no one would ever want to repeat. The punishment for defiance was not just defeat. It was designed to feel final. Medieval writers, trying to convey the horror, sometimes wrote of populations wiped out almost entirely, of bodies counted like grain, of whole regions left quiet where once there had been crowded districts and bustling markets. Modern historians debate those figures and often consider them exaggerated. But even after careful correction, the scale of destruction remains severe. It is as if a hand had swept across the map, smudging out centers of culture and commerce that had taken generations to build. For survivors, if any were left, the city they knew no longer existed. Familiar doorways opened only onto ash and fragments. Streets where processions and festivals once passed now led nowhere. In the middle of all this, the Mongol army moved with a chilling sense of procedure. They dismantled resistance with method and discipline, and the decision to destroy a city was part of a broader strategy. The message was simple, even if the methods were complex. If you submit and cooperate, you may live. You may even be woven into the new order. If you resist, your city may become a warning to anyone else who is thinking of following your example. The darkness of this secret lies less in the act itself than in the cold calculation behind it. It was not an uncontrolled rage, it was policy. The people at the center of these events did not see a clean line between good and evil. They saw smoke, fear, and choices that shrank as the siege dragged on. Some may have tried to flee beforehand, joining the flow of refugees that always follows an approaching army. Others stayed, trusting their leaders or simply having nowhere else to go. From the walls they would have watched dust clouds on the horizon, knowing that every hour of delay brought them closer to an outcome they could not easily imagine. And that, once the walls were breached, numbers and prayers might no longer matter. Centuries later, when we say that Genghis Khan built the largest land empire in history, it is easy to let that phrase pass by as a kind of strange compliment. Yet if you listen to it more carefully in the quiet of your room, you can hear what it hides. Behind that size, behind those impressive boundaries on a map, there were whole landscapes where the tally of the living had been dramatically reduced. Sometimes in a single concentrated storm of violence. The empire's expansion was not just a story of clever diplomacy and bold cavalry charges, it was also a story of cities that no longer existed in the form they once had, of libraries lost, of workshops silenced and of communities turned into statistics in a chronicler's desperate attempt to make sense of the scale. For Genghis Khan, these destroyed cities became part of a harsh kind of arithmetic. Each one eliminated resistance, freed his forces to move forward, and amplified the fear that traveled ahead of them. For his opponents, they were proof that stone and tradition were not enough to guarantee survival. For us, looking back from a soft pillow in a quiet room, they are reminders that beneath grand narratives of conquest there is always a quieter, more painful count being kept, in lives cut short and places erased. As his armies moved farther from the steppe, this pattern of calculated destruction would follow them, shaping not only the spread of his empire, but also the deep unease with which his name would be remembered in many of the lands that felt his shadow. If you listen closely to the story so far, a pattern begins to emerge beneath the noise of hooves and the clash of weapons. It is the pattern of fear, not as a byproduct of war, but as something carefully shaped and guided. For many rulers in history, terror was an accidental consequence of conflict. For Genghis Khan, it became a quiet tool in the background, as essential as the bow, the horse, or the saddle. To understand the darker secrets of his empire, you have to see fear not just as an emotion, but as a kind of invisible army that marched ahead of the real one. When the Mongol forces approached a new city or kingdom, they did not always arrive as an immediate storm. Often, the first contact was diplomatic. Envoys rode out under the protection of custom and tradition, bringing a proposal that sounded, on the surface, almost reasonable. Submit, accept the authority of the great Khan, pay tribute, respect the flow of trade and messengers, and in return, your city would be allowed to live and even to prosper under his shadow. It was presented as a choice, but there was an unspoken line attached to it, like a quiet echo behind every word. Refuse, and the consequences would not be gentle. The power of this offer depended entirely on what people believed would happen if they said no. That belief was shaped not only by logic but by stories. After the first few cities resisted and were crushed with exceptional severity, their fate became a kind of whispered legend that traveled faster than any army. Traders carried the news in scraps and fragments. Refugees brought raw memories of smoke and screams. Even when the details were confused, the central message was clear. The Khan did not simply defeat defiant cities. He destroyed them in ways that would be remembered for generations. Sitting comfortably where you are now, you can imagine how those stories might have felt to someone hearing them in a crowded market square. You might not know exactly how many people died in a far-off city, or which gate fell first, but you would know that resistance had brought something close to obliteration. When Mongol envoys later rode into your own city, their calm faces and measured words would be weighed against these stories that refused to fade. The offer of mercy was real, but so was the threat. Fear had done much of its work long before the first arrow flew on the battlefield. Terror continued to play a role. Mongol commanders were skilled at creating the impression that their forces were larger and more relentless than they actually were. They used feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, stirring confusion and panic. Once a side began to break, chaos spread with frightening speed. A few units collapsing could make others doubt their chances. That doubt could turn into a rush to escape, and that rush could quickly become a rout. In the space of a few moments, an organized army could dissolve into scattered individuals, each trying to survive alone. The Mongols understood this fragile tipping point and pushed hard to reach it. After a particularly stubborn city or fortress fell, the punishment was often designed with an audience in mind. Executions, destruction of defenses, and forced relocations were not just immediate retribution. They were signals sent outward, messages to anyone watching from a distance, anyone who might be debating whether to fight or surrender. The grim reputation of the Mongols was therefore partly constructed by their enemies, who wrote down accounts filled with horror and outrage. Yet that reputation was also shaped, deliberately, by the invaders themselves, who knew that a terrifying story could sometimes do more than 1,000 fresh soldiers. This does not mean that every campaign ended in catastrophe for the conquered. Many cities and regions that chose to submit were spared large-scale destruction. They were taxed, monitored, and occasionally punished if they rebelled, but they were also drawn into the circulation of trade and ideas that the empire encouraged. For them, fear became part of the air they breathed, always present but not always choking. It reminded them what might happen if they stepped too far out of line. They lived under a sky where the same hand that protected caravans and stabilized routes could also order a devastating response to disobedience. For people living under that kind of system, the terror was often quiet in background, rather than constant and loud. It appeared in small decisions. Do you help a neighbor hide evidence of tax evasion, or do you look away, afraid of collective punishment if the local governor is displeased? Do you join a conspiracy to rise up, or do you decide that your children's safety is worth more than distant dreams of independence? The threat did not need to be repeated every day. It lingered in memory, reinforced by occasional, carefully chosen examples. From a modern distance, it is tempting to draw a sharp line around this use of terror and label it as uniquely monstrous. Yet in the soft, reflective mood of late-night listening, you can also see how it fits a broader human pattern. Many regimes, across continents and centuries, have discovered that fear can be cheaper than constant war. Genghis Khan and his successors simply applied this lesson with unusual consistency and scale, combining it with remarkable speed, discipline, and organization. The darkness of this method lies in its cold efficiency. It treated emotions, rumors, and expectations as part of the same toolbox as catapults and siege engines. So when you picture those vast cavalry forces moving across Eurasia, try to imagine not only the visible army but also the invisible one. Ahead of the riders, carried in hurried conversations and nervous glances, went the memory of cities burned and fields abandoned. At the edges of the empire, rulers sat awake at night, considering not just the size of Mongol forces but the stories they had heard, the calculations they had made, and the images they could not shake from their minds. In that sense, terror was not merely a shadow trailing behind conquest. It was a deliberate beam, aimed forward, lighting the path of expansion in a harsh, unforgiving glow. As the Mongol world grew from a patchwork of clans into a sprawling empire, it needed something more durable than fear alone. Terror could open gates and silence rebellion for a while, but it could not, by itself, organize a society that stretched from icy forests to burning deserts. Underneath the thunder of hooves and the glare of burning cities, another force was quietly at work, binding this new world together. It did not ride into battle or stand on the walls. It lived in commands, in customs, and in the memory of those who were allowed to speak of it. This force was a law that later writers called Yasa. The word itself has a slightly mysterious quality, like a name spoken in a low voice between trusted friends. Unlike famous legal codes carved into stone or carefully copied in illuminated manuscripts, the Yasa was never fully revealed in a single clear text. Parts of it were written down. Other parts were transmitted orally, handed from one generation to the next among those close to the Khan and his council. For most subjects of the empire, the law did not exist as a tidy volume they could read. It existed as a set of expectations and consequences, as rumors of harsh punishments, as orders relayed by officials who spoke with the authority of a distant, unseen center. In a sense, the secrecy of the Yasa was one of its most unsettling features. If you cannot see the full code that governs you, you live with a lingering uncertainty. You know some actions are forbidden because you have seen people punished for them. You know other actions are rewarded because you have seen neighbors suddenly promoted or favored. But there is always the chance that a rule you barely understood will suddenly apply to you. That uncertainty, held in place by the reputation of the Khan for strict justice, turned the law into a kind of invisible wall around everyday behavior. At its core, the Yasa seems to have had several purposes. One was discipline inside the army. The Mongol forces were famous for their coordination, and that did not happen by accident. Soldiers who deserted in battle or disobeyed orders could face severe consequences, sometimes extending to their entire unit. In the quiet of the night, when you picture Mongol warriors sharing a fire, you might imagine them joking and telling stories, but you can also sense an underlying tension. Each man knew that his actions were not just his own. If he failed in his duty, his companions might pay the price. That kind of shared responsibility created a hard, almost unbreakable cohesion. Another purpose was to regulate life among the conquered peoples. Under Yasa, theft could be punished harshly. Informal revenge killings, which might have made sense in tribal settings, were suppressed. Instead, conflicts were supposed to be handled through official channels. This may sound strangely modern in some ways. Genghis Khan was not interested in endless blood feuds that distracted from his larger goals. He wanted a world in which caravans could move with relative safety, where merchants felt secure enough to bring wealth from faraway lands into his territories. Protecting traders and messengers was not a moral gesture. It was a strategic one. The law made sure that harming them was treated as a serious offense. There were also rules that touched on aspects of daily life in ways that might feel intrusive to us now. Some described how animals were to be slaughtered, aiming to reduce waste in environments where resources were precious. Others managed hunting rights or dictated how spoils of war should be divided. These regulations may sound small next to the drama of battles and sieges, but they are part of the same structure. They kept the gears of the empire turning smoothly, reducing the friction that might otherwise arise when warriors, nobles, and local officials argued over shares and privileges. For the people at the top, those closest to the Khan, the Yasa was a tool they could wield in subtle ways. They could decide when to emphasize its harshest aspects and when to present its more protective side. A merchant arriving at a Mongol-controlled city might be assured that under the Khan's law, he was safer than he had been under previous rulers who allowed bandits and corrupt officials to flourish. A rebellious town, on the other hand, might be reminded that under the same law, collective punishment could fall swiftly if local leaders failed to maintain order. The law could be a shield or a sword, depending on how and when it was invoked. What makes this legal system one of the darkest secrets of the empire is not simply its severity. Many societies in the past had strict laws. What stands out is the combination of severity with partial invisibility. The Yasa's full shape was always just out of reach for most of the people who lived under it. That lack of transparency meant the Khan and his inner circle could adapt, reinterpret, or selectively reveal parts of the code as circumstances demanded. It gave them a kind of legal flexibility that could feel, from below, like living on shifting ground. Imagine, for a moment, a craftsman in a city recently brought under Mongol rule. He works in his shop, shaping metal or wood, trying to keep his family fed, and his apprentice is busy. He hears fragments of conversations about the Khan's law. Some neighbors say it is fair that it stops powerful nobles from abusing commoners too openly. Others whisper about brutal punishments for minor offenses, about people taken away and never seen again because they broke rules they did not fully understand. For this craftsman, the Yasa is not a text. It is an atmosphere, a sense that someone far away has drawn lines he cannot see, and that crossing them by accident could bring ruin. And yet, from another angle, the Yasa was also one of the reasons the empire could function at the scale it did, with so many different cultures, languages, and traditions under one rule. There had to be a central reference point, a core of authority that did not depend on local customs. The Khan's law offered that. It allowed the Mongols to move administrators around, to plug loyal officials into newly conquered areas, and to insist that their word carried the weight of the great Khan himself. In that way, the hidden spine of legal authority held up the vast, complex body of the empire. Lying in your own quiet space now, you can see how this double-edged system completed the picture we have been building. Fear on the battlefield opened doors. The destruction of resisting cities cleared space, but it was Yasa, the secretive, partly invisible law, that kept the empire standing once the dust settled. It was the whisper behind the shout, the steady hand behind the sword. To understand how Genghis Khan's empire stayed together as long as it did, you cannot look only at the open display of violence. You also have to listen for the quietest sound of rules spoken behind tent walls, carried out by officials who knew that the law they served was both the backbone of order and one of the Khan's darkest instruments of control. When you hear the name Genghis Khan, the image that usually appears is unmistakably male, a hardened face framed by a fur hat, a rider on a powerful horse, a commander at the front of a dust cloud. Yet if you step quietly behind that image and look into the tents, where decisions ripened in the softer light of lamplight, you will find other figures who rarely stand at the center of paintings, but held the threads of the empire in their hands. The story of his power is not only the story of men with bows, it is also the story of women whose influence moved through families, councils, and alliances like an underground river. From the very beginning, women had shaped the boundaries of Temujin's world. His mother Holan was the anchor that kept a group of abandoned children alive on the unforgiving steppe. When the clan left them, she did not collapse. She gathered her sons, taught them how to find food where others saw nothing, and drilled into them a stubborn refusal to vanish. In the quiet hours, when hunger ached and futures looked thin, it was her voice that filled the empty space where the protection of a father once stood. She did not lead armies or give orders to generals, but without her there would have been no leader to rise from that scattered family at all. Later, when Temujin took Bert as his first wife, she became another central pillar. Their marriage was not only a personal union but also a political step, linking Temujin to an important ally. The kidnapping of Bert by enemies was not just a family tragedy, it was an attack on his legitimacy and his future. His determination to rescue her speaks to something deeper than pride. It shows how central she already was to his identity and to the fragile coalition he was trying to build. When he succeeded in bringing her back, she resumed her place not just as a wife, but as a partner whose presence helped stabilize his claim to leadership. Inside the growing Mongol camp, the world of women was complex and layered. They managed households that resembled mobile villages, directing servants, organizing supplies, and making sure that children grew up in an environment where loyalty to the Khan was not only taught but felt. They oversaw the movement of tents, the storage of goods, the care of animals, and the hosting of guests. In this way, they were the managers of the empire's domestic heart. Their work did not appear in chronicles as often as battles, but it made those battles possible. An army cannot travel far without someone, somewhere, making sure there is something to come home to. As the empire expanded, certain women stepped into even larger roles. After Genghis Khan's time, figures like Sorgatani, the widow of his son Tolui, and Trajan, the widow of his son Gade, would become key players in succession struggles and imperial politics. They learned how to navigate the inner circle of power, how to build alliances among princes, and how to influence decisions without always appearing in the official record as the main actors. When a son was chosen as successor or a compromise was brokered between rival branches of the family, there was often a woman in the background who had spent months or years quietly preparing the ground. Even during Genghis Khan's life, marriages were tools he used with careful precision. Daughters and female relatives were married off to rulers of allied or newly subdued tribes, creating bonds that reached beyond treaties written on paper. A princess sent into a distant region carried with her the authority of the Khan's house and the expectation that she would stabilize the area through her presence. In the privacy of her new home, she might counsel her husband, pass messages, and act as an informal ambassador for her father's or grandfather's interests. Her life in many ways was a chain of obligations. Yet within those obligations there was room for subtle influence. These women also acted as guardians of memory. They remembered who had supported the family when it was weak and who had turned away. They remembered insults and kindnesses that men, busy with war, might forget. Around the hearth, in conversations with children and grandchildren, they passed on versions of events that official chroniclers rarely heard. In those quiet lessons, they shaped how future leaders saw their own past, which enemies they viewed with special suspicion, and which alliances felt more like old friendships than convenient arrangements. There is a darker side to their story as well. Some women entered the circle of the Khan's family, not by their own choice, but as part of the spoils of conquest or as forced brides in political unions. Their homes had been overrun, their previous lives erased, and now they were expected to smile at the man who symbolized that upheaval. The empire's stability, in many places, rested on this kind of enforced intimacy. These women often learned to survive by carefully reading the moods of powerful men, adapting to new customs, and finding a narrow path where they could protect their children and preserve small pieces of their original identity without provoking dangerous anger. If you picture the imperial camp as a living organism, the women were its nervous system, carrying information, emotion, and influence from one part to another. They soothed tensions within the family, reminded ambitious sons of their father's wishes, and sometimes pushed those sons toward actions that served their own long-term plans. They were not always gentle or purely noble either. Ambition, rivalry, and jealousy could thrive in the women's quarters just as fiercely as in military councils. A whispered remark, a strategically timed story, or an accusation made in private could alter the course of inheritance and, by extension, the politics of entire regions. From the outside, however, most of this activity remained invisible. Foreign observers who wrote about Genghis Khan and his successes tended to focus on what they could see: leaders on horseback, armies on the move, fortresses under siege. They mentioned wives and mothers only in passing, as supporting characters. The deeper truth, which you can sense in the calm of this listening moment, is that the empire's inner balance depended heavily on relationships that were negotiated not in open assemblies but inside conversations inside felt tents and palaces. The hands that rocked cradles and poured fermented mare's milk also steered the next generation of rulers toward certain choices and away from others. In this way, one of the empire's quiet secrets is that a power often remembered as purely masculine was in reality sustained by networks of influence heavily shaped by women. Some loved the man at its center. Some feared him, some resented the circumstances that had bound them to his house, but all of them, in their own ways, added strands to the web that kept his world from tearing apart too quickly. As the empire grew outwards, these subtle, mostly unrecorded influences would play a crucial role in how his sons and grandsons managed the fragile inheritance left behind by a conqueror whose face the world remembered but whose power in many ways rested on voices that history only barely allowed us to hear. In the middle of all this growing power, one of the darkest and most delicate secrets of Genghis Khan's world was not written on any battlefield. It lived instead inside his own family, wrapped around a single question that no one could ever answer with complete certainty. That question revolved around his eldest son, Joki. To the outside world, the Mongol imperial line could look solid and straightforward, as if it sprang fully formed from the will of one man. Inside the family, however, there was a crack that never quite closed, and it began with a raid and a kidnapping. Before Temujin became the Great Khan, his young marriage to Bert had already been tested in a brutal way. Enemies from the Merkit group attacked and carried her off, along with other family members. For Temujin, it was a moment that struck at everything he held dear: his honor, his alliances, and the fragile sense of stability he was trying to build. He gathered allies, staged a rescue, and eventually brought Bert back. Not long afterward, she was found to be pregnant. The timing cast a shadow. Was the child Temujin's conceived before the kidnapping, or was he the offspring of one of her captors? In the stillness of your room, you can feel how impossible that question would have been to resolve in their world. There were no tests, no scientific way to put the matter to rest. What remained were feelings, guesses, and choices. Temujin accepted the boy, naming him Joki and raising him as his son. That decision alone shaped the future of the empire. By acknowledging the child, he gave Joki a place not only in the family but in the line of succession. Yet acceptance did not erase doubt. It merely pushed it out of sight, where it could quietly influence relationships for years to come. Among his brothers, Joki carried a complicated status. He was the eldest, which, in many systems, would make him the natural heir. But some of his siblings, especially Chagatai, are said to have openly questioned his legitimacy. The debate was not just about private jealousy. It went straight to the heart of who had the right to inherit the vast, expanding authority of the Khan. To think of it in simple terms, imagine living in a family where one brother is constantly reminded, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that some people think he does not truly belong, even though his father defends him. That tension does not disappear just because everyone tries to act polite at official gatherings. It simmers. The way Genghis Khan handled this sensitive situation reveals another layer of his character. He does not seem to have allowed anyone to strip Joki publicly of his status as a son. At the same time, when the question of succession became unavoidable, he chose not to place the entire future of the empire on Joki's shoulders. Instead, he selected Gadai, a younger son, as his designated heir. On the surface, this choice was framed as wise and balanced. Gadai was described as even-tempered, a good mediator between his brothers. Underneath that public justification, however, lay the quieter reality that placing Joki on the throne would have reopened every whispered doubt and every old insult. The empire might have begun its next phase under a cloud of internal suspicion. Joki himself was not simply a passive figure in this drama. He commanded forces, led campaigns in remote regions, and developed his own base of power on the empire's western edge. He was respected by many of his men, and he seems to have had a vision that sometimes diverged from his father's hunger for constant expansion. Some accounts suggest that he grew uneasy with the scale of destruction in certain campaigns, preferring a more measured approach. Whether this is fully accurate or partly shaped by later storytellers, it adds an interesting shade to his image, the possibly reluctant son of a relentless conqueror. The end of Joki's life adds another layer of mystery. Sources differ on the details. Some say he died of illness before his father, far from the central court, his health worn down by the demands of continuous campaign and the strain of his position. Others hint at darker possibilities, including quiet removal triggered by political tensions. The truth remains uncertain behind centuries of rumor and biased accounts. What matters for our story, especially in this late-night reflective mood, is that he left the stage without ever fully claiming the place his birth order might have promised him. Because Joki died before Genghis Khan, the question of his direct succession faded, but its effects did not. His sons, particularly Batu, would later carve out powerful domains in the West, shaping the history of regions that would come to be known as the Golden Horde. In this way, the doubt that had surrounded their father's origins did not stop his line from becoming one of the major branches of the imperial family. Yet, under the surface, the memory of those old arguments about legitimacy continued to influence how other branches viewed them. Families remember things for a long time, especially when those memories are tied to power. If you sit with this story for a moment, you can sense how fragile even the greatest empires can be when you look closely at their foundations. On maps, the lines of conquest look clean and strong. In biographies, the succession from one ruler to the next is often summarized in a single neat sentence. But behind those summaries lie unresolved questions, hurt feelings, and choices that could have gone another way. The figure of Joki, at once acknowledged and doubted, loved and questioned, stands as a reminder that the darkest secrets of an empire are not always acts of violence committed against outsiders. Sometimes they are unresolved tensions living quietly inside the ruling family's own tent. As you drift deeper into this narrative, it becomes clear that Genghis Khan's power was not only forged in battlefields and council meetings, it was also shaped by how he handled the delicate, painful matter of a son whose very existence challenged the neat story of an unbroken bloodline. The decision to accept Joki publicly, yet to pass the main inheritance to another son, was a compromise that kept the empire together in the short term while planting seeds of rivalry for the future. It is one of those choices that rarely make it into heroic legends, but that quietly steer the course of history for generations to come. When a city fell to the Mongol armies, not everyone died and not everyone stayed. Some of the most important consequences of conquest did not lie in the ashes of burned houses, but in the columns of people that began to move afterward, pushed along roads they had never chosen to walk. If you could stand on a hill above one of those conquered regions and look down, you would see more than soldiers packing up their camps. You would see lines of captives, craftsmen, scholars, and ordinary families being led away, their futures quietly rewritten in the shadow of an empire that treated human movement as another resource to be managed. The Mongols understood something very practical. They came from a nomadic background with few permanent cities of their own, and they knew they needed skills that their traditional way of life did not naturally provide. Artisans, engineers, doctors, translators, and scribes were as valuable to them as gold or silk. When a city surrendered or was taken, these people were often singled out and spared, not out of kindness, but because the empire needed their hands and minds. Some chronicles describe scenes where the population of a captured city was gathered outside its walls, and groups were sorted. Craftsmen to one side, soldiers and nobles to another, the rest told their fate with a gesture or a word. If you imagine yourself among those artisans, the moment of separation would feel like a quiet, devastating cut. One instant you belong to a city, with its familiar streets and routines. The next, you are part of an inventory. A Mongol officer, perhaps with the help of local interpreters, asks what you can do. Are you a metal worker, a stone cutter, a weaver, a physician? Your answer can save your life, but it also binds you to a path that leads far from your home. You might be sent east, toward newly built centers like Karakoram, or west, to help reshape a city that had been damaged and now needed to be made useful for its new masters. These movements were not gentle relocations. They were forced migrations, planned from above. Families were often split, with some members kept for their skills and others sold or absorbed into different communities. Among the captives, there were also people taken simply as labor, men to work in fields or construction, women and children to serve in households or be sold into various forms of servitude. In later Mongol realms like the Golden Horde, slave labor became a major part of urban life and building projects with deported workers, helping to raise new quarters, workshops, and fortifications in cities that owed their rapid growth to the energy of people who had arrived in chains. From a distance, the empire's rulers could see only the benefits. Population from one region was used to strengthen another. Skilled workers from a rebellious city were transplanted into a more loyal one. A famous calligrapher from one end of the empire might find himself decorating the palace of a Khan thousands of kilometers away. A group of engineers who had once helped manage irrigation in a prosperous valley could be ordered to build new systems in lands the Mongols wanted to develop. The map of talent and labor across Eurasia was quietly redrawn, not by free choice, but by orders delivered on horseback. For the people caught up in these invisible caravans, however, the experience was personal and often heartbreaking. Imagine walking day after day, under guard, not knowing where the march would end. The language around you changes gradually. The style of dress, the landscape, the smell of the air, all shift. At some point, you realize that even if you survive, the world you knew is no longer reachable. Letters, if they could be written at all, might never find their way back. Children grow up remembering only fragments of the place their parents still call home and half-forgotten stories told by the fire. Yet, within this tragedy, there were moments of adaptation and strange new beginnings. Some deported artisans eventually built stable lives in their new locations. They opened workshops, trained apprentices, and passed on techniques that blended with local traditions to create new hybrid styles in art, architecture, and craft. Their forced movement contributed to the spread of ideas and technologies across vast distances. The same empire that had uprooted them also created routes along which their skills and designs could travel, shaping the look and feel of places they had never planned to see. The moral weight of this is difficult to hold in a single emotion. On one hand, the Mongol Empire's ability to mix peoples and skills did lead to an extraordinary circulation of knowledge. On the other hand, that circulation rested on broken lives, fractured communities, and journeys made under duress. In the quiet of your night, as you listen, you can allow both truths to sit side by side. The Empire's achievements in connecting distant regions cannot be separated from the human cost paid by those who walked its roads without choosing to. There is another, subtler consequence of these forced migrations. They blurred identities. A child born to deported parents in a new city might grow up speaking a different language from the one heard in the cradle. Over time, local histories start to include people whose grandparents came from far away, often without anyone remembering exactly why. The memory of conquest fades, leaving behind only surnames, accents, or craft traditions that hint at older displacements. The darkness of this secret lies not only in the initial trauma, but in the way it gradually disappears into everyday life, leaving descendants to live in a reality shaped by historical violence they no longer fully see. From the perspective of Genghis Khan and his successors, these human movements were part of a grand design. They were solutions to logistical problems, answers to the question of how to supply labor and expertise to regions under new rule. From the perspective of the people in those columns of captives, they were the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. When you picture the Mongol Empire now, try not to see only the sweeping armies and the glittering courts. Try also to see these quieter processions, stretching across the landscape like long threads, tying together lands that would never again be completely separate. In many ways, those threads outlasted the empire itself. Long after the central authority fractured and the great khans were gone, communities shaped by forced migration remained where they had been planted. Markets still hummed with a mix of styles and techniques. Words borrowed from distant languages lingered in local vocabularies. The caravans had stopped, but the changes they brought stayed woven into the fabric of everyday life. That is one of the empire's deepest, most enduring secrets, the way it turned people into living bridges between cultures, at a cost that only becomes fully visible when you pause in the calm of the night and imagine the footsteps of all those who walked farther from home than they ever wanted to go. If you close your eyes for a moment and picture the Mongol Empire, you might see banners, dust, and the heavy rhythm of armies on the move. But if you shift your focus just a little, another picture appears, softer and quieter. On the same roads that carried soldiers, there were also caravans of merchants, small groups of envoys, and lone riders changing horses at simple roadside stations. These figures did not make much noise in chronicles, yet they were part of one of the Empire's most important secrets, the way it turned information and movement into instruments of power. Long before they conquered a city, the Mongols often knew more about it than its own neighbors did. This knowledge did not come only from formal spies in dark cloaks. It flowed through conversations with traders, travelers, and defectors, through reports gathered after small raids, through questions asked casually in markets years before any army appeared at the gates. A merchant who had crossed a distant region might be invited for a drink and asked in an almost friendly tone about the layout of a city, the strength of its walls, the reliability of its ruler, the mood of its people. To him it might feel like harmless talk. To the Mongols it was the slow assembly of a mental map. As the empire expanded, Genghis Khan and his successors built something that made this flow of information even more effective. A relay system of stations and fresh horses that stretched like a nervous system across their territories. Riders carrying messages could travel astonishing distances in a short time by changing mounts at regular intervals, passing through waypoints where food, shelter, and replacements awaited them. To a weary courier, these stations must have felt like islands of safety in a sea of open land. To the rulers they were the veins and arteries that kept the empire alive. Orders, news of rebellions, updates on weather and trade, all moved along this web. In the silence of nighttime listening, you can imagine one of these riders approaching a station. The sky is dark, the air is cool, and the outline of a simple building or tent appears ahead. Inside, someone is already awake, expecting him. A fresh horse is waiting, its breath steaming in the cold. The rider hands over a small, sealed packet or a verbal message, drinks quickly, and moves on. The stop takes only minutes, but it is repeated over and over, all across the empire, day after day. This constant motion means the Great Khan can know, with surprising speed, what is happening far from his current camp. For an emperor without telegraphs or radios, it is as close to instant awareness as his age will allow. Merchants benefited from this system too, even as they were carefully watched. Under Mongol rule, many trade routes became safer than they had been for a long time. Bandits who used to extort caravans were hunted down or forced into more organized roles under local officials. Taxes were collected, yes, but they often came with the promise of protection. A trader traveling from one end of the empire to the other could, in some periods, rely on a continuity of law and custom that had been rare before. In this sense, the empire's roads were not only pathways of conquest, they were corridors along which silk, spices, paper, metals, and ideas moved with renewed confidence. Yet this apparent gift came wrapped in strings. Protection was not free. In exchange for safety, merchants and local elites had to accept the presence of Mongol agents who monitored activity, collected tolls, and occasionally asked probing questions. A caravan was not only a collection of goods, it was also a moving source of intelligence. Where had the traders come from? What rumors had they heard? Were there signs of unrest in a far-off province? The same system that made commerce easier also turned the commercial world into a giant roaming network of informants, many of whom did not fully realize how much they were contributing to the empire's awareness. At times, more explicit espionage was woven into this fabric. Scouts were sent ahead of armies disguised as simple travelers. Local guides were recruited, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, to provide detailed information about terrain, water sources, and supply points. Defectors from enemy courts were questioned carefully, their gossip sifted for useful patterns. All of this fed into a central pool of knowledge that allowed Mongol commanders to plan campaigns with stunning precision. Battles were rarely fought blind, even in unfamiliar lands. The invaders often knew where key crossings, storage sites, and weak points were long before their enemies realized they were being studied. For ordinary people, most of this remained invisible. A shopkeeper in a market might notice that Mongol tax collectors seemed unusually well informed about local prices and disputes, but he would not see the whole chain of conversations and messages behind that awareness. A village elder might be surprised to find that an imperial envoy already knew about a recent argument with a neighboring settlement. To them it could feel as though the state had eyes in places where no official banner flew. In a way it did. Its eyes were the same ones that looked out from the windows of caravanserais and inns, from small rest stops and trading outposts along dusty roads. There is a quiet darkness in this level of control. On the surface it allowed for relative safety and predictability, which many populations appreciated after years of chaotic warfare. But beneath that, it meant that very little could happen without someone, somewhere, taking note. The roads that carried hope and profit also carried surveillance. A song sung too freely, a complaint voiced too loudly, could travel along with the goods, reaching ears that had the power to respond harshly. In such a world, people learned to weigh their words carefully, even in seemingly casual conversations with strangers who might, intentionally or not, carry their stories onward. From Genghis Khan's perspective, this web of information and movement was one of his greatest strengths. It turned a vast, diverse territory into something he could feel under his fingertips. He did not need to stand in every marketplace to sense the temperature of his empire. Reports brought by riders and merchants gave him a diffuse but constant awareness. That awareness, combined with his readiness to act quickly and decisively, allowed him to respond to challenges before they grew too large. In that sense, the quiet roads and their busy stations were as much a part of his military apparatus as any unit of elite cavalry. As you lie back and follow this story, you may notice how different this side of the empire feels from the shock of sieges and massacres. Here the tools are not catapults and ladders, but questions and saddles, sealed messages and fresh horses. Yet the goal is similar: to maintain control over a restless, sprawling world. The Mongol system of roads and relays turned distance into something manageable, and people into carriers of both goods and secrets. It is one of the less visible, but deeply significant, ways in which Genghis Khan's empire reached into the lives of millions, quietly shaping what they could do, where they could go, and what they dared to say. To understand the darker secrets of this empire, it helps to leave the tents of the rulers for a moment and step into the shoes of an ordinary person living in a conquered city. Not a famous general, not a prince, but someone whose name never appears in any chronicle. Imagine that you wake up in a house that looks very much like it did before the Mongols came, with the same courtyard, the same worn doorway, the same crack in the wall you have been meaning to fix. Yet, when you listen carefully, you realize that the city around you is not quite the same. It breathes differently now. The first difference is the presence of new faces and positions of power. Where local soldiers once patrolled the streets in familiar armor, now there are Mongol guards, often accompanied by interpreters and local collaborators. They do not shout much. They do not need to. Their mere presence is often enough. They know that everyone has heard what happened to cities that chose to resist. They carry that knowledge like an invisible banner. When they walk through the bazaar, people make way, lowering their eyes just enough to signal caution without looking openly afraid. This is not the frantic terror of a siege. It is a quieter, more enduring kind of fear. You go to your stall or your workshop, as you always have. Business must continue. People still need bread, cloth, tools, and medicine. The empire expects taxes, and you know that if you do not work, you will not be able to pay. At the city gate, caravans arrive under the protection of the new rulers. There are more foreigners now, merchants from distant lands who feel safer on the roads than they did before. They bring unfamiliar goods, and with them, unfamiliar stories. Some speak of new opportunities, more customers, more routes, more connections. Others speak in lower tones about harsh punishments in towns where governors claimed taxes were missing. One of the most unsettling changes lies in how information moves. Under the old regime, you might have complained openly about a corrupt official or a greedy noble, knowing that your words would spread slowly, if at all. Now, you are less sure where your complaints might end up. A casual remark at a tea stall could be repeated to a tax collector, then to an imperial representative, and suddenly your name might be on a list you never wanted to be on. This does not mean the city is full of professional spies. It means that people have learned to be careful, because the line between harmless talk and dangerous talk has become thinner and less visible. Sometimes, news circulates that the Khan has decreed lower taxes for certain regions, or that merchants are to be given special protections. You notice that these announcements arrive with impressive speed, carried by riders changing horses at stations outside the city walls. The message is clear. The empire is listening, watching, adjusting. It can reward and it can punish, and it can do both from far away. There is something coldly efficient in this arrangement. Life becomes a balance between gratitude for the relative order and unease about the price of that order. Religious life also adapts. Temples, mosques, churches, and shrines may remain open. Though occasionally leaders are called to meetings with Mongol officials, they are reminded that they may continue to worship, to teach, to collect alms, so long as they do not encourage open resistance or hide wealth from imperial record keepers. Some spiritual leaders gain influence by presenting themselves as mediators between the people and the distant rulers, using their position to negotiate small favors or protections. Others chafe under the supervision, feeling that their sacred authority has been quietly placed under someone else's shadow. For ordinary believers, the rituals go on, but there is an undercurrent of tension, a sense that even the language used in sermons must be chosen carefully. On certain days, the city feels almost normal. Children chase each other through alleys laughing. Street sellers call out prices in the same rhythmic patterns they used before. The smell of cooking rises from kitchens at dusk. If you were to look quickly, you might think nothing had changed. But then you notice the Mongol officers sitting at a corner table, listening. You remember that some neighborhoods were never rebuilt after the conquest, left as quiet reminders of what resistance had cost. You see, in the eyes of older residents, a kind of permanent watchfulness that youngsters, who barely remember the time before, do not yet have. From time to time, something happens that breaks the surface calm. Perhaps a tax collector is attacked in a remote district, or someone is caught hoarding goods to avoid levies. Rumors spread that the governor is angry. Within days, a show of force takes place. Arrests, public punishments, or new inspections. These episodes are usually limited in scope, but they are enough to refresh everyone's memory of who holds real power. Afterward, the city settles back into its routine, but with a slightly tighter feeling, as if the air has thickened. Conversations become a bit more cautious. People remind each other of stories from other towns where things went badly, letting the fear travel just enough to keep everyone aligned. For families who lost relatives during the conquest, the shadow never fully lifts. They live with an absence that no amount of relative peace can fill. Yet survival is stubborn. New children are born. Businesses reopen or are started from scratch. People adapt because they must. They learn how to answer officials politely, how to fill out forms or respond to questions in ways that draw no extra attention. They memorize the rhythms of tax collection and try to stay one step ahead of misfortune. Over time, some even begin to see small benefits, a larger market for their goods, new ideas and technologies arriving along the empire's roads, a kind of stability that had been missing before. In this everyday life under Mongol rule, there is a strange blend of normality and quiet pressure. The darkest secrets of the empire are not always visible in dramatic events. They also live in these subtle adjustments, in the way people's thoughts bend around what they know they are allowed to say and do. The empire's power seeps into habits, shaping how people greet one another, how they discuss politics, how they weigh the risks of speaking out. It does not need to roar every day. It only needs to be present, like a heavy object in the room that no one mentions but everyone feels. As you listen, you may notice that this world does not fit neatly into a simple category of horror or benefit. For many city dwellers, Mongol rule was a mixture of both. It brought the memory of fire and the reality of new roads, the fear of collective punishment, and the relief of fewer petty bandits on the highways. It made life safer in some ways, and more fragile in others. That ambiguity is one of the quieter, more unsettling aspects of Genghis Khan's legacy. The empire did not only destroy, it also reshaped, organized, and managed, leaving people to live in a constant compromise between what they had lost and what they were trying to build within the limits set for them. When the dust of a conquest settled and the counting of the dead was done, there was another kind of tally that began, almost as quietly as a list whispered in the dark. It was the count of those who would not die, but would not be free anymore either. In the wake of Mongol victories, people themselves became a form of plunder, measured not only in numbers, but in skills, beauty, youth, and usefulness. If you want to grasp one of the more unsettling layers of this empire, you have to follow these living spoils as they are gathered, sorted, and folded into a world that sees them less as individuals and more as resources. In the chaotic hours after a city fell, the line between death and survival could be drawn by something as simple as who noticed you first. Warriors searching for loot might pass by a frightened family hiding in a cellar. An officer with an eye for talent might ask who among the prisoners could read or work metal. A noble might glance at the captives and select anyone whose face or posture suggested status, beauty, or potential value in negotiation. Those chosen did not receive mercy in the way we might imagine it. Their lives were spared, but only to be redirected. Men with strong backs and no particular connections were often taken as laborers. They were marched away to dig trenches, build fortifications, or work in fields controlled by new masters. Their days became cycles of heavy work, their identities reduced to what their bodies could produce. Some were sold along the routes that connected different parts of the empire, changing owners multiple times, their names fading in each transaction. They did not always wear chains or manacles. In many cases, their captivity was enforced by distance from home, lack of resources, and the knowledge that trying to escape through unfamiliar territory could be a slow, lonely way to die. Women faced a different, though equally constrained, fate. Some were taken into households as servants, expected to cook, clean, fetch water, and care for children who were not their own. Others, especially those judged attractive or of noble birth, were brought into the more intimate spheres of conquerors' lives as secondary wives or concubines. Official histories often describe these unions in neutral or even positive terms, focusing on the alliances they represented or the children they produced. From the perspective of the women involved, however, the story would have sounded very different. They had seen their cities fall, their previous lives shattered, and now they were expected to accept new husbands or masters as if the past had been nothing more than a bad dream. Inside the tents and palaces of the ruling elite, such women lived in a complex web of hierarchy and competition. A first wife, often married for political reasons before the height of conquest, might hold high status and considerable influence. Captive women who entered later had to find careful ways to survive beneath her shadow. They learned when to speak, when to stay silent, how to manage jealousy and suspicion, how to protect their children from being pushed aside in struggles over inheritance and favor. Some, over time, developed real influence of their own, becoming trusted confidants or mothers of sons who would one day lead armies. Others remained in the background, their thoughts and feelings unrecorded, their lives remembered only in the bloodlines of descendants who would never know their full stories. Children born from these unions carried the complicated weight of their mother's situation. On one hand, they could be raised as members of the conquering family, with access to training, education, and opportunities denied to the conquered population at large. On the other hand, whispers about their origins might follow them. In a world where lineage and clan identity meant everything, being the child of a father who had arrived as a conqueror and a mother taken from a defeated people could be both an advantage and a vulnerability. Some rose to important positions, others were quietly kept away from succession, their presence useful but never fully comfortable for those who prized pure heritage. There was also another, less visible dimension to this captivity. Not all captives were kept close to elite households or used in grand building projects. Many were scattered across smaller estates, villages, and camps, far from the places where chronicles were written. Their work supported the everyday functioning of the empire, tending herds, carrying water, cooking food for soldiers, repairing carts, and performing countless tasks that never made it into official records. If you could walk through those spaces in your mind, you would see people whose lives had been split in two, a before tied to a lost home and an after in which they were expected to act as if that home no longer mattered. In the silence of your own room, it is worth pausing to consider how this system blurs the line between victim and tool. From the Mongol perspective, taking people as plunder was efficient. It turned defeat into a source of labor and expertise. It helped populate new cities, fill gaps in skilled trades, and reward loyal commanders with servants and companions. From the perspective of those taken, their lives became evidence that survival can sometimes mean living inside someone else's victory. They carried their memories with them, but those memories did not change the fact that their futures were now shaped by the needs and moods of others. Over time, some captives adapted so completely that their grandchildren might barely recognize the family's origins. Language changed, clothing changed, even religious practices shifted under pressure or persuasion. Yet, in small habits, in recipes, lullabies, or stories told at night, traces of their old world might persist. A certain way of braiding hair, a particular prayer whispered before sleep, a melody hummed without thinking. These were the quiet streaks of color that refused to fade entirely, even as the empire tried to repaint everything in its own tones. When historians discuss the Mongol Empire's achievements in trade, administration, and cultural exchange, they sometimes describe it as an early form of globalization, a system that connected East and West with unusual intensity. That description is not entirely wrong, but it leaves out the forced nature of so many of those connections. The empire did not ask everyone whether they wanted to move, to serve, to marry into new families. It often decided for them. In that sense, the global links it forged were woven partly from threads of unwilling journeys and coerced relationships. As you drift deeper into this listening, it becomes clear that the empire's darkest secrets are not only found in battlefield atrocities or the destruction of cities. They also lie in these quieter, longer stories of captivity and adaptation. People taken as plunder carried the empire's weight on their shoulders and in their hearts, turning its victories into daily routines, cooking its food, raising its children, maintaining its households. Their names have mostly slipped away, but the shape of their lives still lingers in the shadow of the Khan's legacy, like faint footprints on a road that once seemed endless. In many stories about the Mongol Empire, there is a surprising detail that catches people off guard. For all the harshness of its conquests, this empire is often described as unusually tolerant when it comes to religion. In an age when many rulers tied their legitimacy tightly to a single faith, Genghis Khan and his successors allowed a wide range of beliefs to coexist under their rule. At first glance, this sounds almost comforting, like a patch of soft grass in an otherwise rough landscape. But if you look more closely, in the calm of this late hour, you find that even this tolerance carried quiet chains. Genghis Khan grew up in a world shaped by the sky and the land. The traditional beliefs of the steppe were centered on Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and on the spirits of earth and ancestors. Shamans beat drums, burned offerings, and acted as bridges between the seen and unseen. For people who lived with the wind as their constant companion, it made sense to feel that power flowed directly from the heavens, not from the walls of a temple. When Temujin rose as a leader, he carried this sense of direct sky-given authority with him. He did not need a priesthood to crown him. He believed that his victories were proof enough that the high sky approved. As his armies moved out into settled lands, they encountered a patchwork of faiths. In one region, church bells rang over stone domes. In another, the call to prayer floated above the rooftops. Elsewhere, Buddhist monasteries stood on hillsides, filled with chanting and the smell of incense. Instead of trying to crush these religions into one official mold, the Mongols often took a more flexible approach. Priests, monks, imams, and other spiritual leaders were frequently granted exemptions from certain taxes. Their communities were allowed to maintain their rituals, languages, and teachings, as long as they accepted the new political reality. The Khan ruled the land. Whatever god or gods ruled the heavens. For the ordinary believer, this could feel surprisingly gentle compared to what they feared. When a Mongol army approached, some may have expected that their faith would be attacked, their holy places burned. Instead, after the storm of conquest, they might find their temples or mosques still standing, their religious leaders still leading services. The relief was real. People clung to their rituals even more tightly, grateful that at least this part of their world remained intact. In the quiet after evening prayers, families might speak of the Khan with wary respect, noting that he seemed more interested in taxes and loyalty than in telling them how to pray. But beneath that surface, the arrangement was more precise and practical than it looked. Religious freedom was not a gift given out of pure idealism. It was a strategic decision, allowing local faiths to continue, with their own networks of trust and moral authority, made governing easier. Spiritual leaders could calm their followers, discourage rebellion, and frame obedience to the Khan as compatible with obedience to divine will. In exchange, they were expected to avoid stirring up resistance and to cooperate when imperial officials needed information or support. If a religious figure stayed within those unwritten lines, they could enjoy a relatively stable position. They might even gain influence at court, advising Mongol rulers on philosophical questions, offering blessings, or providing exotic knowledge about medicine, astrology, or law. A Christian monk, a Muslim scholar, a Buddhist lama, and a Taoist priest might all find themselves, at different times, welcomed into the same circle of power, their presence a sign of the empire's broad reach. To visitors, this could look like a model of harmony. To those inside the system, it was also a delicate balancing act, sustained by the understanding that favor from above could vanish as quickly as it appeared. When religious communities stepped beyond the accepted boundaries, the response could be sharp. A preacher who openly encouraged defiance, a shrine that became a hub for conspiracy, or a group that refused to pay taxes under cover of spiritual privilege could find that the empire's patience had limits. Privileges were revoked, leaders might be removed from their positions, quietly or suddenly. In more serious cases, entire communities could face collective punishment, not because of their beliefs in heaven, but because of their challenge to authority on earth. The message was always the same: you may worship as you wish, but the ground under your feet belongs to the Khan. For some individuals, this tension created a subtle unease. A devout merchant who appreciated the safety of Mongol roads might still feel conflicted about paying taxes that supported an empire so often associated with destruction. A priest who received protection from the authorities might worry that his closeness to power would make his followers question his independence. Spiritual leaders had to navigate carefully, choosing words, symbols, and alliances, with the awareness that a misstep could bring trouble not only to themselves, but to the people who trusted them. The Mongol rulers themselves sometimes explored different religions with curious, almost experimental minds. Later Khans held debates where representatives of various faiths argued their points, not always to choose a single winner, but to display the ruler's command over a religiously diverse world. Some flirted with conversion, drawn by the moral structures or promises offered by foreign creeds. Yet even when individual rulers leaned toward one tradition or another, the empire as a whole rarely enforced one faith as the only acceptable path. Political unity, not spiritual uniformity, remained the primary goal. From a modern distance, it is tempting to praise this approach as ahead of its time, a kind of early pluralism, and in some ways it did create space for coexistence that other empires lacked. Scholars, pilgrims, and missionaries moved across Mongol lands, carrying ideas as easily as merchants carried goods. Translation projects flourished in certain cities, where sacred texts and philosophical works were studied and shared. To a thoughtful observer wandering through such a city, it might have seemed that the empire had found a way to let many beliefs live side by side. Yet, as you lie back and let the story unfold, it is important to remember the hidden conditions attached to this coexistence. The safety enjoyed by religious communities was always conditional on their political obedience. The tolerance could be wide, but it was never unconditional. The underlying structure was not a circle of equal faiths, it was a pyramid, with the Khan at the top and every other authority, however sacred, positioned below. Spiritual leaders who forgot that hierarchy did so at their own risk. In this light, the empire's religious policy becomes one more example of its broader pattern, a mix of genuine openness and firm control. Genghis Khan and his successors were willing to let many paths to the divine exist under their rule, as long as all those paths crossed, eventually, under the arch of their power. It is a calmer, less visibly brutal aspect of their legacy, but it carries its own quiet darkness. Faith was permitted to flourish, but only as long as it did not challenge the ultimate loyalty demanded by the empire. Every life, even the most turbulent, eventually narrows to a final moment. For Genghis Khan, that moment has been wrapped in a fog so thick that even centuries of historians, storytellers, and archaeologists have not been able to pierce it completely. When you listen to the end of his life in the quiet of your own room, you are listening not to a clear report, but 2 layers of rumor, fragments of chronicles, and the careful absences left by people who had reasons not to speak too plainly. His death is less a simple event than a cluster of possibilities, each one casting a slightly different shadow across his legacy. What we seem to know is this: near the end of his life, Genghis Khan was still campaigning, still moving, still trying to bend resisting regions to his will. He did not retire into peaceful old age in a distant palace. Instead, he remained close to the rhythms that had defined his existence from the beginning: horses of tents, councils of war, and the hard land under open skies. Somewhere in this restless final phase, he fell ill or was injured. The exact cause, however, is where the ground begins to shift. Some accounts say he was thrown from a horse during a hunt or battle, an accident that might seem almost fitting for a man whose entire rise had been built on his mastery of riding. Others suggest a fever, an infection, or complications from earlier wounds that had never fully healed. Then there are the more colorful versions, stories told in later times that add drama at the cost of reliability. In some of these, Genghis Khan is mortally hurt in an encounter with a captured princess or during a clandestine attack inside his own camp. These tales are vivid, easy to imagine, and perfectly suited to dramatic retellings. Yet, when examined closely, they rest on thin foundations, repeated more for their emotional impact than for their evidence. In the calm atmosphere of late-night listening, it becomes easier to set these aside as what they likely are: legends built around the idea that such a larger-than-life figure must have died in a way equally spectacular rather than from something as ordinary as illness or age. The truth may be less theatrical and more human. A man who had spent his life in harsh climates, riding long distances, facing wounds and exhaustion, could simply have reached the point where his body could no longer keep up with his will. In many ways, that is a more sobering image. Instead of a dramatic final duel or a last-minute betrayal, we are left with a picture of an aging conqueror lying in a tent, perhaps listening to the faint sounds of his camp beyond the walls, aware that the empire he had built was now moving beyond his direct control. Battle plans, succession arrangements, and unfinished campaigns would all have pressed against the edge of his awareness, mingling with whatever pain or weakness he felt. The secrecy surrounding his death was not accidental. For rulers of his kind, the moment when they are no longer invincible is a dangerous one. News of serious illness or death could encourage enemies to rise, allies to hesitate, and ambitious subordinates to act. Keeping the details limited to a small circle gave his successors time to manage the transition, to decide how and when to announce what had happened, and to shape the story before it spread. It is possible that, for a while, ordinary soldiers and subjects continued to hear orders issued in his name, unaware that the voice behind them had already faded. In this gap between reality and knowledge, the empire continued to move forward on momentum alone. There was also a deeper layer to this silence. For many on this step, Genghis Khan was not just a political leader. He was a figure whose success had been interpreted as a sign of favor from the eternal sky. To admit openly that such a man had died in a banal or humiliating way might have felt almost like a challenge to that belief. By allowing the details to remain vague, his followers could more easily focus on the idea that his time on Earth had simply reached its appointed end, that the sky which had raised him had now called him back in that way. Mystery became a form of respect, a way of preserving a sense of grandeur around a fact that, in the end, comes for everyone. Imagine, for a moment, the atmosphere in the tent where his closest companions gathered after his passing. The man who had once been Temujin, the abandoned boy, the relentless unifier, the terror of cities, now lay still. Around him stood generals, sons, and advisors whose lives had been shaped almost entirely by his presence. Some must have felt genuine grief, others anxiety about what came next, still others the stirrings of opportunity. Outside, the camp continued its routines. Horses fed, fires stoked, guards rotated. History often shows us distant dates and plain statements. But moments like this were thick with emotion, too complicated to fit into a simple line in a chronicle. In time, the news would have to be shared more widely, and the story, whatever form it took, would settle into the official narrative. The emphasis would be on his achievements, his conquests, his laws, and the destiny he had carved for his people. The uncertainties, the rumors, and the quiet practicalities of his final days would be set aside. The empire could not afford to linger over the vulnerability of its founder. It needed to move quickly into the phase of succession, coronations, and new campaigns. The man who had filled so much space in the world now had to be compressed into a memory that served the needs of those who inherited his throne. For us, listening centuries later, The unclear nature of his death is more than a historical curiosity. It is a symbol of the way power often tries to control not only life, but the story told about its end. Genghis Khan shaped the fate of millions. Yet in this one crucial moment, he becomes as opaque as any ordinary person whose final breath goes undocumented. The empire he built survived him, at least for a while, but the exact details of how he slipped from life into legend remain out of reach. In that sense, the greatest conqueror of his age shares something with the humblest of his subjects, a final chapter that no one can completely reconstruct. As you let this image settle, you may feel a shift in the way you see him. The unstoppable rider becomes, for a brief instant, just a man who reached the end of his strength. The sky he believed in keeps stretching overhead, indifferent and unchanging. His banners, once symbols of terror and order, are folded away or passed on to others. The mystery around his death does not make him more or less responsible for what he did in life. It simply adds one more shadow to a story already full of darkness and light, inviting us to remember that even those who seem larger than life cannot escape the most basic truth. Every empire and every person eventually has to face the silence that comes after the last command is given. If the circumstances of Genghis Khan's death are wrapped in mist, the fate of his body is hidden even deeper, like a stone dropped into dark water that never quite reaches the bottom. For many famous rulers, tombs are built to be seen. They rise above the landscape as declarations of importance, covered in carvings and inscriptions that demand to be remembered. In the case of Genghis Khan, however, the story seems to have moved in the opposite direction. Instead of a monument that shouts his name to the world, there is a silence so carefully maintained that it has become one of the most haunting secrets of his empire. Legend tells us that after his death, the funeral procession carried his body back toward the Mongol heartland, accompanied by loyal guards determined to keep his resting place hidden. In some versions of the story, anyone who crossed paths with this procession was quietly removed, so that no stray witness could later point out the route. Whether or not this happened exactly as described, the detail captures the mood of the tale. Secrecy as an act of devotion, and perhaps also as an act of fear. The body of the Khan was not just the remains of a man. It was a symbol that needed to be protected from enemies, grave robbers, and maybe even from the curiosity of his own people. Different sources offer different endings to this journey. One says that a hidden valley was chosen, remote and shielded by hills, where the body was laid to rest and the earth carefully smoothed over until no trace of digging remained. Another claims that a river was deliberately diverted, its waters commanded to sweep over the grave so that no one could ever find it again beneath the new riverbed. Still another story adds a final chilling twist. After the burial was complete, the soldiers responsible for guarding the site were themselves killed, ensuring that no living soul would be able to reveal the location. These versions may conflict in their details, but they all point toward the same idea, repeated like a soft refrain: the tomb of the Khan must not be found. In the quiet darkness of your room, you can imagine that hidden place, wherever it may be. Perhaps it lies beneath a stand of trees on a lonely hillside, where the wind passes through the branches with no hint of the secret below. Perhaps it rests under a stretch of open grass, indistinguishable from any other patch of steppe, the soil knitted back together by seasons of rain and snow. There is no great stone marker, no carved image, no inscription boasting of victories. The man who commanded vast armies now has, if these stories are true, a grave that looks like nothing at all. Centuries later, explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers would become fascinated by the idea of finding this lost resting place. Some mounted expeditions, scanning the landscape, studying ancient texts, and following local legends in the hope that some overlooked clue would reveal the truth. Modern technology joined the search, with aerial surveys and satellite images combing the Mongolian terrain for patterns that might hint at human intervention. Yet, despite all this effort, there is still no widely accepted, definitive answer. The grave remains, at best, a strong suspicion rather than a confirmed discovery. This enduring mystery has given the site, wherever it is, a strange kind of power. It is as if the land itself has become part of the story, keeping its secret for the man who once believed that the eternal blue sky watched over him. In a world that often digs up the past, turning ancient rulers into museum exhibits and tourist attractions, Genghis Khan's body has, so far, refused to enter that cycle. He stays where he is, unpointed to by signs, unphotographed, unvisited by crowds. That absence is almost louder than a monument would be. There is a darker undertone to this too. The decision to hide his grave may have been driven partly by religious and cultural beliefs. a desire to prevent desecration or to keep the memory of the Khan pure and untainted by relic hunters. But it also fits neatly into the broader pattern of control that marked his reign. A visible tomb can become a rallying point, a symbol that different groups might claim, reinterpret, or use as a focal point for their own purposes. A hidden tomb, by contrast, remains firmly in the hands of those who control the story. If no one can stand before a marker and say, "Here he lies," then no one can easily use that place to challenge the authority of his heirs or to build a rival cult of memory. For the people who lived in the first generations after his death, the secrecy around his grave must have added to the aura that surrounded his name. Children would grow up hearing that the Khan had returned to the earth in a place only a few trusted individuals knew, if anyone did at all. The sky above their heads was the same sky he had served, the same sky that had blessed his conquests. The land under their feet might, somewhere, hold his bones. That thought could be both comforting and unsettling. It suggested that the founder of their world was not locked away in some distant, unreachable monument. He was out there, somewhere, in the same wide landscape they inhabited, present and absent at once. From our vantage point now, this hidden grave invites reflection on how societies choose to remember powerful figures. Many empires build colossal tombs as if to shout, across generations, "Do not forget who ruled you." The Mongol choice, at least in this case, was to whisper instead. The memory of Genghis Khan persisted not through a physical structure, but through stories, laws, lineages, and the ongoing impact of the world he had forced into being. His empire fractured after his death, splitting into different khanates, but his name remained a reference point, a symbol claimed in various ways by his descendants and by later nations. All of that happened without a public grave. As you think about this in the soft quiet of the night, it might occur to you that the absence of a tomb is strangely fitting. The empire he created was never meant to stand still. It was a web of movement, of roads and riders, sieges and migrations. To mark his final resting place with a towering monument might felt almost out of character for a man whose life was spent in motion. Instead, he seems to have vanished into the steppe he knew so well, leaving the land itself as his only monument. The mystery of his grave becomes, in this sense, an extension of his story, powerful, unsettling, and fundamentally hard to pin down. One day, perhaps, someone will claim to have found it beyond serious doubt. If that happens, there will be debates about how to handle such a discovery, whether to open it, study it, or leave it untouched in respect for old customs. Until then, the resting place of Genghis Khan remains one of history's softest whispered questions. It lingers at the edge of certainty, always inviting another guess, another theory, another search. And in that lingering question lies one of the darkest, most elegant secrets of his empire. That even in death he has managed to stay just out of reach, his body folded into the same vast landscape that once echoed with the hoofbeats of his armies. Empires rarely mean to change the world in ways they cannot predict. They think in terms of borders, tribute, and glory, not in invisible currents of disease or long-term shifts in the way land is used. Yet when you look at the Mongol Empire from a wider angle, another layer of its legacy begins to appear, one that has less to do with banners and more to do with the quiet movements of tiny organisms and the slow responses of climate and soil. In the gentle silence of tonight, we can let that wider picture come into focus without rushing to easy conclusions. One of the most unsettling connections often discussed by historians is the relationship between Mongol era trade networks and the later spread of the Black Death. The great pandemic that swept across Eurasia in the 14th century, killing vast numbers of people from China to Europe, did not begin as a Mongol project. It was born from bacteria carried by fleas and rodents, thriving in particular environmental conditions. Yet, the speed and reach of its movement were shaped, in part, by the very roads and routes that the Mongol Empire had strengthened. In other words, the same system that allowed merchants, scholars, and ideas to travel more freely also created lanes along which disease could move with frightening efficiency. This does not mean that Genghis Khan or his successors caused the plague in a deliberate sense. They did not understand germs in the way we do now. To them, sickness was often seen as a test from the heavens, a mysterious force that struck some and spared others. But the structure they built, a vast, connected space in which people, animals, and goods flowed more constantly than before, gave such diseases far more opportunities to leap from host to host, city to city, caravan to caravan. It is a grim example of how even well-organized systems designed for power and profit can carry dark side effects that only become clear generations later. There are also stories, some more reliable than others, about Mongol armies using disease as a weapon. hurling the bodies of plague victims over the walls of besieged cities in a desperate attempt to weaken the defenders. Whether this tactic was common practice or rare exception is still debated, and it is difficult to separate careful scholarship from dramatic storytelling. What matters, in the soft light of this late reflection, is the underlying fact that armies and diseases moved together, each one amplifying the impact of the other. Soldiers traveled, camped, and besieged, and wherever they went, they brought not just weapons and fear, but also the invisible passengers that clung to their clothes and their animals. Beyond disease, the Mongol conquests touched the environment in quieter, slower ways. In regions that were heavily fought over, fields were abandoned, irrigation systems neglected, and villages emptied. Some lands that had once been carefully tended slipped back toward wilderness for a time. Trees grew where crops had been. Wild animals returned to spaces that had been cleared. In other areas, the opposite happened. New settlements were created. Forests cut for building and fuel. Pastures expanded for the herds that fed armies and cities. Each campaign, each forced migration, left a small mark on the landscape, and over decades, those marks added up. On the open steppe, the relationship between people, animals, and grass was especially delicate. The Mongols were masters of managing herds and grazing patterns, but even they were not immune to the pressures of growth. As more groups were drawn into the empire's orbit, competition for the best pastures could increase. Overgrazing in some areas might have led to patches of land that needed years to recover. In a good year, this might not be noticeable. In a sequence of harsh winters or dry summers, however, the margin between enough grass and too little could become dangerously thin. Climate itself was not a passive backdrop in this story. There is evidence that certain periods of Mongol expansion coincided with stretches of relatively favorable weather on the steppe. Milder temperatures, good rainfall, better grass. These conditions would have supported larger herds and healthier horses, giving the nomads a strong base for their campaigns. Later shifts in climate, with colder spells or more erratic rainfall, may have contributed to tensions and stresses in the regions under Mongol influence. Armies and empires like to think they rule by will and strategy alone, but they are always, silently, negotiating with the sky and the seasons. For ordinary people, these environmental and epidemiological changes did not appear as abstract trends. They showed up as small, painful realities. A farmer noticed that the canal his grandfather had relied on was no longer maintained, and his fields yielded less. A herder discovered that the grass on a familiar hill was growing thinner each year. A city dweller watched food prices rise as supplies became unpredictable. When disease struck, it did not arrive announcing itself as part of a grand historical process. It arrived as a fever in a child, a swelling in a neighbor, a string of funerals that drained a street of laughter. In this quiet moment, it becomes clear how deeply interconnected everything was. The empire of Genghis Khan was designed to move people and goods across enormous distances. That same movement also transferred seeds, animals, parasites, and illnesses. It altered how land was used, which forests were cut, which rivers were redirected, which plains were trampled. None of this appears in the triumphant lists of conquered cities, yet it is part of the same story. The world that emerged after the Mongol period was not only different in its political borders, it was also different in its ecological balance and in the health patterns of its populations. When we talk about the darkest secrets of this empire, we often focus on intentional cruelty massacres, forced migrations, ruthless laws. But history's shadows are not always cast by deliberate acts. Sometimes they arise from side effects, from systems that work so well in one area that they create unexpected harm in another. The Mongol Empire's efficiency at connecting distant places helped shape the world in ways its founders never imagined, some inspiring and some deeply tragic. As you let your mind drift over this wide, connected landscape, you can sense how fragile human plans are when measured against the quiet forces of nature and disease. Genghis Khan could command armies and rewrite maps, but he could not command the wind that carried pathogens or the tiny organisms that rode in the fur of rats. In the end, even the mightiest of human structures must share the stage with these unseen actors. That realization adds a softer, more reflective layer to our understanding of his legacy, reminding us that power is always woven into a fabric much larger than itself. Empires do not only conquer land, they also try to conquer the story of what happened. After the dust of battle settles and the dead are buried, a quieter struggle begins over which memories will be preserved, which will be softened, and which will disappear altogether. In the case of Genghis Khan, the struggle lives in the gap between the polished chronicles that praise him and a more intimate, often harsher voice that survives in what we now call the secret history of the Mongols. Listening to that contrast in the stillness of night, you can almost hear two different choirs singing over the same life. On one side, you have the official or semi-official accounts written by people who had strong reasons to present the Khan as a near-perfect ruler. These writers emphasized his sense of justice, his military genius, and his role in unifying a divided people. They highlighted stories where he rewarded loyalty, punished treason, and treated even powerful enemies fairly if they submitted. In their pages, he often appears as a kind of stern but ultimately wise father of the nation, chosen by the heavens to bring order to a chaotic world. Such narratives were useful. They gave his successors a noble ancestor to point to when justifying their own claims to power. On the other side sits a very different kind of document, compiled in Mongolian and kept for a long time away from public eyes. The secret history does not always read like a carefully cleaned-up monument. It lingers on awkward moments, family quarrels, early defeats, strange omens, and decisions that do not fit neatly into a heroic mold. It records the killing of Temujin's half-brother, the tensions with Joki, and the complicated, sometimes humiliating episodes of his youth. It shows a leader who sometimes doubted, hesitated, or lashed out in anger, rather than a flawless figure moving through history with unbroken certainty. Why would such a text exist at all in a world so concerned with image? Perhaps because it was not meant for wide public consumption. It may have been compiled as an internal family record, a guide and warning for future generations of the ruling line. In that context, honesty about embarrassing incidents becomes a kind of harsh wisdom. A grandson reading about his grandfather's missteps might learn what to avoid. A prince studying these stories might understand that even the great Genghis Khan had to struggle, adjust, and sometimes pay a price for his choices. In this sense, the secret quality of the history was not only about hiding shame, it was about preserving truths too sharp to expose to everyone, but too important to lose entirely. If you imagine a scene where court officials sit together, deciding what to record in the more public chronicles, you can feel the tension between truth and usefulness. A scribe might suggest including a certain story about an early failure, only to be told that it would weaken the image of the founder in the eyes of foreign readers. Another might propose highlighting a cruel punishment, and someone higher up might shake their head, worried about how future generations would judge the dynasty. Bit by bit, the official narrative is whittled into a smooth shape, like a stone polished by many careful hands. It shines, but some of its original edges are gone. Meanwhile, the rougher details are not entirely lost. They survive in quieter retellings within families, among certain elites, and eventually, in texts not meant for the full public stage. These less polished stories are where the empire's darkest secrets sit. They show that the man who demanded absolute loyalty was not immune to fear or insecurity. They reveal that the unity of the Mongols did not appear magically, but was forged through betrayals, desperate gambles, and the suppression of rivals whose names later became footnotes or vanished altogether. This split between public image and private memory is not unique to the Mongols, of course. Many societies have one story for display and another for those inside the circle. What makes it particularly striking here is the scale of the gap. In a glowing official account, Genghis Khan might look almost like a mythic figure, purpose-built to justify the empire's existence. In the more candid secret voice, he appears as a human being shaped by hunger, fear, loss, and ambition, whose methods could be as unsettling as his goals were grand. For people living under his successors, this duality would have had subtle effects. A noble who had access to more complete stories might view the founder with a complex mixture of respect and cautious awareness, a common subject. Hearing mainly the polished version repeated in proclamations and ceremonies, would see a more distant, almost legendary figure. In that distance lies both comfort and danger. It is comforting to believe in a flawless founder. It is dangerous, because it can make the darker parts of the empire's behavior feel easier to ignore, as if they were necessary steps in the fulfillment of a grand destiny. As you listen now, you have access to both sides at once, at least in spirit. You can acknowledge the extraordinary organization, adaptability, and vision that allowed a group of steppe tribes to build an empire stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. You can also sit with the knowledge that this achievement involved acts of cruelty, erasure, and control that were deliberately softened or hidden in many accounts. The secret history does not counsel the greatness claimed by the chronicles, and the chronicles do not erase the raw honesty of the secret text. Together they form a mirror with two faces, each reflecting the same man in a different light. In the quiet of your room, this double image invites a gentler kind of judgment. Instead of deciding whether Genghis Khan was purely a hero or purely a monster, you can see him as a person whose story has been pulled, pushed, and edited according to the needs of those who came after. The darkest secrets of his empire are not only the things he did, but the ways in which those deeds were later arranged into patterns that made sense to the powerful. Somewhere between the shining surface of official memory and the rough grain of private records lies the closest thing to truth, still imperfect, still incomplete, but more honest in its willingness to admit that empires are built not just on glory, but on all the uncomfortable details that someone, somewhere, once tried to hide. As time moved on and the dust of his campaigns settled into the soil of many lands, Genghis Khan began to change shape in the eyes of the world. The man who had once been a very real presence, someone whose orders could burn a city or spare it slowly, turned into an idea that different groups could mold to their own needs. In the quiet distance of centuries, he became a canvas onto which people painted very different pictures: a military genius, a founding father, a barbarian destroyer, a symbol of national pride, or a warning from history. Which image you saw depended a great deal on where you were standing. In some modern narratives, especially those written from within or near Mongolia, Genghis Khan is remembered first as a unifier. Before him, the steppe had been fractured, full of feuding clans and unstable alliances. Under his leadership, that fractured landscape turned into a more cohesive political entity. From this angle, his conquests are seen not only as outward expansion, but as the birth of a national moment when scattered groups came to see themselves as part of something larger, with a shared history and identity. In such stories, the emphasis falls on his legal reforms, his willingness to promote talented people regardless of birth, and his ability to knit together a functioning state out of what had once been constant conflict. Elsewhere, particularly in regions that suffered most from his wars, the memory is much harsher. In parts of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, the name of Genghis Khan has long been associated with devastation. Oral traditions and later histories speak of cities turned to ruins, fields left empty, and populations drastically reduced. For people whose local ancestors endured those campaigns, the idea of calling him a genius can feel almost obscene. They remember him instead as a force of destruction, someone whose ambition wrote itself in fire across their landscapes. In these narratives, the supposed benefits of expanded trade or unified law vanish behind the raw experience of loss. Modern historians have tried to navigate between these extremes, and their debates add another layer to the story. Some have pointed out ways in which Mongol rule, for all its brutality, created conditions for increased contact between different parts of Eurasia. They highlight the movement of ideas, inventions, and artistic styles that took place along the routes the empire secured. They note that, compared to some contemporary states, the Mongols were relatively open to religious diversity and to using skilled administrators from many different backgrounds. From this perspective, Genghis Khan appears as a harsh but strangely modern figure, someone who unintentionally laid the groundwork for a more interconnected world. Other scholars, however, cautioned against letting these more positive elements overshadow the violence. They remind us that the connectivity the empire fostered came at an immense human cost, paid disproportionately by people who had no say in whether they wanted to join this new order. They warned that admiring the efficiency of Mongol administration or the cleverness of their tactics can easily slide into romanticizing conquest itself, making it sound cleaner, more rational, and more necessary than it felt to those whose lives were shattered by it. In their view, any assessment of Genghis Khan that does not fully acknowledge the scale of suffering his campaigns produced remains incomplete. If you listen carefully, you can hear a quieter question beneath these arguments. What exactly do we choose to value when we look back at someone like him? Do we prioritize the scale of the empire he built, the administrative innovations he helped set in motion, the way his name still resonates in national myths? Or do we focus on the lives broken, the cultures disrupted, the cities erased? To some extent, both sides are part of the same reality. The roads that allowed knowledge and goods to move also carried armies. The laws that brought a kind of order to vast territories were enforced by the memory of extreme punishments. The unification of the steppe made possible the destruction of distant kingdoms. In modern Mongolia, statues and monuments now stand where once there was only open land. Schools teach children about Genghis Khan as a founding figure, someone to be proud of. His image appears on currency, products, and in popular culture. For many, reclaiming him from centuries of foreign criticism is a way of asserting identity and dignity in the present. At the same time, in textbooks and documentaries in other countries, his name is sometimes placed alongside those of other infamous conquerors, symbols of what happens when one person's will is allowed to override the safety and autonomy of others. From the gentle vantage point of sleepless listening, you do not have to pick a single final verdict. Instead, you can let these conflicting views rest side by side, like layers of rock built up over time. You can acknowledge that he was, undeniably, a figure of extraordinary ability, able to adapt, to learn from mistakes, to coordinate massive operations across huge distances. You can also acknowledge that he used those abilities in ways that caused suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. Greatness, in the sense of impact, does not have to mean goodness. Influence can be both impressive and deeply troubling at the same time. Thinking of him in this nuanced way may feel less satisfying than placing him firmly in a category of hero or villain. Clear labels are comforting. They tidy up the messiness of the past. But history rarely cooperates with our need for simplicity. In the case of Genghis Khan, the very intensity of his impact forces us to sit with contradictions. He was a nation builder and a destroyer of nations. He created systems that improved trade and systems that depended on fear. He inspired loyalty and spread terror, often in the same breath. As you lie there, perhaps starting to feel the edges of sleep press in, you might notice that this complexity mirrors something about our own time. We, too, live with leaders, systems, and technologies that bring both benefits and harms. We too will be judged by future generations trying to weigh our achievements against the costs we accepted or ignored. In that sense, reflecting on Genghis Khan is not just about looking backward. It is also about quietly asking ourselves what kind of legacy we are building, and which parts of it we might prefer future storytellers to emphasize or quietly set aside. When history books describe the Mongol conquests, they often speak in sweeping terms. They talk about millions of people, about percentages of populations, about regions depopulated or rebuilt. Numbers like these have a cold clarity, but they also hide something. The texture of individual lives that never had a chance to become more than a brief ripple in the great tide of events. To feel the darker secrets of Genghis Khan's empire more fully, you have to step away from the language of statistics and walk, slowly, into the smaller stories that were never written down. Imagine a family in a small village far from the capitals that receive most of the attention. Before any Mongol army appears, their world is already complicated. Seasons that give or withhold rain. Taxes owed to a local lord, disputes with neighbors over land or water. They are not heroes or villains. They are simply busy, trying to keep crops alive or animals healthy, hoping that this year will be just a little better than the last. News of distant wars reaches them in fragments, carried by travelers and rumors. At first, the Mongols are simply another frightening story in a world where frightening stories are already common. Then, one year, the rumors come closer. Traders mention that nearby towns have fallen. Refugees arrive with haunted faces. Speaking of riders who appear suddenly and leave devastation behind, the family listens by lamplight, trying to decide what matters and what is exaggerated. They have no detailed maps, no way to check numbers, no council of experts. What they have is a growing sense that something large and uncontrollable is moving in their direction. Anxiety begins to seep into everyday tasks. A simple chore like fetching water now carries a quiet question. How long will this routine still exist? When the Mongol forces finally pass through their region, the impact might not look like the dramatic destruction described in tales of great cities. It might be less theatrical, but no less profound. Perhaps the village is forced to supply food and animals to passing troops, leaving the family with barely enough to make it through winter. Perhaps some of the stronger young men are taken as auxiliaries or laborers, promised rewards that may or may not materialize. Perhaps one of the daughters is selected for service in a distant household, her parents watching as she disappears down a road they will never be able to follow. None of these events will make it into grand chronicles, yet they rearrange the family's future completely. The years that follow are shaped by this disruption. A missing son means fewer hands to work the soil. A missing daughter means a gap at the hearth, a silence where her laughter used to be. New rulers demand taxes measured not only in coin but in grain, livestock or labor. The family adjusts because there is no alternative. They plant slightly different crops, stretch food further, teach younger children to take on tasks sooner than they should. They survive, but the shape of their survival is narrower than it once was. Dreams they barely had time to form, buying more land, improving the house, sending a child to study in a nearby town, are quietly folded away. In another part of the empire, a similar story unfolds with slightly different details. A craftsman in a city is conscripted to help rebuild walls or construct new facilities for Mongol officials. His skills keep him alive, even grant him a certain respect, but they also tether him to projects that do not serve his family's needs. His long days are spent on structures that will make it easier for the new regime to tax, monitor, and control the population. When he returns home at night, tired and stained with dust, he holds his child and wonders what kind of world he is helping to build, one in which his talents have given his family some safety, but at the ethical price of supporting a system many of his neighbors fear. Multiply these stories by thousands, then by millions, and you begin to sense the full weight of the empire's impact. Not just in the lives ended abruptly, but in the lives bent subtly. People who might have become poets or scholars instead became soldiers, porters, or servants. Small communities that might have grown into stable, prosperous towns were emptied or redirected. Local traditions passed from parent to child in songs and rituals were interrupted by refugees scattering in all directions. Some of those traditions survived, finding new homes. Others faded with the last person who remembered them. Children born into this world after the initial conquests carried the effects in ways they did not fully understand. For them, Mongol rule was not a shocking new development. It was simply the way things were. They grew up in villages that had already been reshaped, in cities whose defenses and markets had been reconfigured. They heard their grandparents' stories about life before, but those tales sounded half mythical, like legends from a different age. Their own realities were bound up with the empire's structures. Its taxes, its roads, its laws, its dangers. They adapted, joked, fell in love, and made plans, just like people anywhere. Yet, underlying their lives was a foundation laid by decisions made in distant tense decades earlier. From the perspective of Genghis Khan and his closest advisors, these countless small adjustments were likely invisible. They saw big patterns, tribute flowing, borders secure, campaigns won or lost. On a map spread out in a council tent, a region was a shape to be managed, a problem to be solved. Within that shape, however, were garden plots, workbenches, kitchens, and cradles, each with its own delicate balance. The empire's darkest secret lies in how easily those intimate balances were disturbed by decisions made far away, and how little those at the top were required to think about the cost borne by people they would never meet. As you rest in the dark and let these images pass, you may feel a quiet shift in how you hear words like conquest and expansion. They become less like abstract processes and more like weather storms that roll over ordinary lives, changing what they can and cannot do. The Mongol Empire was, without question, one of the most powerful systems of its age, but power, viewed from below, often looks like a series of compromises forced on people who would rather have been left to their own small ambitions. The hidden cost of that power rarely appears in official records. It lives instead in the silences between lines, in the corners of letters that never mention certain losses because words are not enough, or because people are too tired to write them down. It lives in lullabies, sung to children in new lands, in accents shaped by mixing tongues, in the way a grandmother's hands tremble slightly when she speaks of the village she left behind. To feel the full weight of Genghis Khan's empire, you have to listen not only to the roaring parts of history, but also to these almost inaudible echoes, the ones that fade quickly, but never completely, from the world. If you let your eyes rest for a moment and simply breathe, you can turn this whole story into a kind of slow journey. Not the frantic rush of an army on campaign, but a quieter walk across the world that Genghis Khan reshaped. You do not need boots or a horse, you only need imagination, drifting from one landscape to another, noticing how the same empire could feel very different depending on where you stood beneath its shadow. Begin on the open steppe, under a sky so wide it seems almost unreal. The air is cold, but clean, and the horizon stretches in every direction like a slow gray-blue wave. Herds of horses move in broad arcs, tended by riders wrapped in furs, their silhouettes small against the distance. Tents dot the land, round and low, their smoke rising in thin threads that the wind quickly pulls apart. In one of those tents, a family sits close to a central fire, sharing meat and fermented mare's milk. They speak of taxes owed, of rumors from the west, of sons serving in distant campaigns. For them, the empire is both a source of pride and a demanding master. It has given them a sense of unity they did not know before, but it has also taken their strongest riders far away, into battles they can only picture in their minds. Now let the scene shift slowly southward, to a city on a caravan route. It is early morning, and the streets are still cool. Shopkeepers lift wooden shutters, revealing shelves of fabrics, spices, tools, and books. The Mongol conquest is no longer fresh here. The walls show scars where stones were repaired after a siege years ago, and there is a quiet plaque or simple marker remembering the dead, but daily life has returned. Officials in foreign-style robes move through the crowd, accompanied by local assistants who help them read documents and extract taxes. In the marketplace, traders from far-off lands bargain in a mixture of tongues, adjusting prices with quick mental calculations that include not only costs and profits, but also the tolls demanded along the roads. Above it all, the name of the Khan is a distant presence, like a flag somewhere beyond the visible rooftops, reminding everyone that this city is part of something larger than its own walls. Walk further, in your mind, into a quieter neighborhood inside the same city. Here the sounds soften. Children play in narrow alleys, their games a mix of old traditions and new words picked up from soldiers and travelers. An elderly woman sits by a door, spinning wool and watching them. She remembers the day the Mongols first arrived, remembers hiding in a cellar while screams and smoke filled the air. Now, years later, the same streets are filled with ordinary errands, but her memory has not faded. Sometimes she tells the children stories of before, and they sit with wide eyes, trying to imagine a time when different flags flew above the gates and different faces commanded fear. For them, this empire is all they have ever known. Her stories feel like tales from a distant age, half real, half legend. Let your imagination step westward, over mountains and rivers, to a settlement on the frontier of Mongol influence. Here the empire's presence is more intermittent. Patrols pass through, collecting tribute and checking for signs of unrest, but local customs remain strong. Farmers tend terraced fields, lifting their heads only briefly when riders appear on the ridge. In the evening, village elders gather under a tree or in a small hall, discussing how to respond to the latest demands from distant overlords. Some argue that cooperation is necessary, that survival depends on bending rather than breaking. Others, with anger in their voices, insist that something precious is being lost each time they submit. The conversation loops like this, circling around the same fears and hopes, never fully hoping shift again. Now toward the east, into the heart of lands that once resisted fiercely and paid dearly. The ruins of an old fortress stand near a rebuilt town, their broken stones left untouched as a deliberate reminder. People pass them without stopping, but children sometimes dare each other to climb the shattered walls, feeling a mix of excitement and discomfort they cannot fully explain. Local clergy or teachers occasionally use the ruins as a lesson, pointing at the collapsed towers as they speak of the dangers of pride or the cost of defiance. In this way, the past is folded into moral stories, reshaping raw trauma into something people can live with, even if the scar never quite disappears. As you continue this journey, you can pause at a roadside station on one of the great imperial routes. A tired rider arrives, dismounts and hands over a message. Another takes his place, mounting a fresh horse and galloping off toward a far-off destination. Nearby, a small group of travelers rests, cooking a simple meal over a low fire. Among them is a former captive artisan, now employed in the city he had never heard of as a child. He stares into the flames, thinking of the home he lost and the skills that saved his life. In his pocket, perhaps, is a small token from his birthplace, a scrap of cloth, a charm, a stone. It is almost nothing, yet it weighs as much as an entire homeland in his mind. Follow the road further to a newly important city, one that has grown because of its position within the empire. Workshops hum with activity as craftsmen from different backgrounds share techniques. A building might display decorative patterns from one culture carved into an architectural layout borrowed from another. In this mingling you can see some of the empire's unintended gifts, a cross-pollination of styles, and ideas that would not have met so easily without the enforced connections of conquest. At the same time, you can sense the shadow behind this diversity, knowing that many of the people who made it possible arrived under duress, carried along by currents they did not choose. End your walk, for now, back on the steppe at night. The tents are dark against the sky, and the stars seem almost close enough to touch. Somewhere, a storyteller sits with a small circle of listeners, recounting the deeds of Genghis Khan and his successors. He speaks of bravery, unity, destiny, and the favor of the eternal blue sky. He may hint at darker episodes, but he chooses his words carefully, aware of who is listening. His voice rises and falls in a soothing rhythm, and some of the younger children begin to drift toward sleep, their dreams filled with riders, banners, and distant cities they will never see. As you lie there, listening to your own quiet breathing, you have just walked through a slice of that empire without leaving your bed. You have seen its roads and its tents, its markets and its ruins, its old wounds and its new routines. This imagined journey reveals one more secret of Genghis Khan's world, that its impact was not only measured in grand events but in the countless everyday moments, shared meals, anxious meetings, small acts of kindness and cruelty that unfolded under a sky that watched them all without comment. By now, the outlines of Genghis Khan's empire look very different from the sharp, simple shapes you might see in a schoolbook map. They look softer, more complicated, full of overlapping stories and quiet contradictions. To reach this point, we have wandered through battlefields and bedrooms, law codes and hidden graves, city streets and empty steps. One last, dimly lit room remains to visit before we let the story rest. The place where memory is edited, where empires decide what to remember and what to let fade. Every society, without exception, trims its past. Some events are polished and displayed proudly, like treasures in a cabinet. Others are pushed into corners, covered by cloth, or quietly walked around as if they were not there. The Mongol Empire was no different. Over time, songs, rituals, and official stories came to emphasize certain parts of Genghis Khan's life. His rise from hardship, his ability to unite the steppe, his victories over powerful enemies, and his establishment of laws that, at least in some areas, brought order where chaos had reigned. These memories gave people a sense of identity and purpose. They offered a narrative that could turn a patchwork of tribes into a people with a shared ancestor. But to build that kind of proud story, other elements had to be softened or omitted. The massacres that left cities silent, the forced migrations that tore families apart, the deep fear that lived in the hearts of conquered subjects, these did not fit easily into the image of a righteous founder. They were not entirely denied. Some were too well known to erase. Instead, they were reframed. Brutal campaigns became necessary steps toward unity. Harsh laws became expressions of firm justice. The suffering of enemies was recast as fate, or as the inevitable price of resisting a destiny blessed by the sky. Within Mongol and later successor states, this framing allowed people to live with a difficult legacy. It is hard to build daily pride on top of unfiltered horror, so the horror was wrapped in layers of explanation. Genghis Khan was not simply cruel, he was decisive. He did not merely destroy, he cleared the way for a more stable world, for those who benefited from the order that followed. These interpretations were easier to accept than the alternative that their peace rested on. Foundations soaked in the pain of others. Beyond the lands that later claimed him as a national ancestor, memory took a different path. In cities that had been burned, or in cultures that had lost more than they gained, Genghis Khan remained a symbol of catastrophe. Here, the stories told to children at night did not emphasize his clever laws or his protection of merchants. They lingered instead on the sound of hooves approaching, on gates shattered, on the eerie quiet after an army had moved on. The empire was remembered not as a stage of proud history, but as a wound, an interruption in a story that might otherwise have unfolded more gently. Over centuries, these different strands of memory grew further apart, like branches from the same trunk stretching toward different pieces of sky. Modern nationalism added fresh layers. New states sought heroes to anchor their identities, and Genghis Khan, with his undeniable impact and native origins on the steppe, was a powerful candidate. Statues rose where once there had been open land. Museums reinterpreted objects. Textbooks shifted tone at the same time. In other countries, narratives of victimhood and survival hardened, using the Mongol invasions as key chapters in tales of resilience against overwhelming odds. What gets lost in this tug-of-war is often the quiet middle ground, the recognition that an empire can be both impressive and devastating, that a single life can hold both admirable resilience and terrifying ruthlessness. The darkest secrets are not just the ugly acts themselves, but the way later generations learn to look past them, or to decorate them with explanations that make them easier to live with. It is easier to say he had to be that harsh than to sit with the possibility that vast suffering could have been avoided, or that the world might have taken a different path. If you let your mind settle gently on this thought, you may feel a familiar pattern. We still do this today, with more recent histories. We choose which leaders to honor with monuments, which anniversaries to celebrate, which tragedies to treat as central, and which to relegate to footnotes. We to edit. We to decide what kind of story about ourselves we want to pass on. In that sense, the way Genghis Khan has been remembered and misremembered is not an ancient curiosity. It is a mirror quietly reflecting our own relationship with power, success, and the costs we prefer not to dwell on. Sometimes, the most honest way to approach this past is not to push for a single verdict, but to accept the discomfort of holding several truths at once. Genghis Khan was a unifier and a destroyer. His empire encouraged trade and unleashed terror. His legacy helped shape nations and traumatized others. To insist that he was only one of these things is to flatten a complex reality into something easier but less real. To accept him as all of them at once is harder, but it aligns more closely with how human history actually unfolds, with tangled motives, mixed results, and stories that refuse to fit neatly into light or dark. As you lie here, listening to the soft rustle of your own breathing, you are doing something that the subjects of his empire also did, in their own way. You are thinking about which parts of a powerful story deserve your attention, which details matter, and how to carry the weight of other people's suffering without turning away. That quiet act of reflection is, in itself, a gentle resistance to the tidying instincts of official history. It acknowledges that the past is messy and that, sometimes, the only respectful response is to sit with that mess for a while, without trying to polish it into something more comfortable. At the beginning of this long night story, we started with a simple image, a distant campfire on the horizon, and a name that has echoed across centuries, Genghis Khan. Along the way, that distant flame turned into something more complicated. It lit up battlefields and trade roads, family quarrels and secret laws, ruined cities and hidden graves. Now, as we reach the end, the fire has burned low again, leaving only a soft glow and a sky stretched wide above everything that happened. In that dim light, it becomes easier to see his empire not as a neat legend, but as a restless legacy still humming under the surface of our world. When we think back over the path we have walked, certain scenes stand out. A hungry boy abandoned with his family on the steppe, learning that loyalty can dissolve overnight. A young leader cleansing the grasslands of rival clans so thoroughly that their names become cautionary stories instead of living neighbors. Walls of stone shuddering under the weight of siege machines, while inside, people debate whether to fight or surrender, each choice carrying its own kind of doom. Quiet columns of captives and craftsmen shuffling away from their homes, carrying tools, talents, and memories into a future they never chose. We have heard about a law that tried to knit this vast, unruly world together, a law partly spoken, partly hidden, harsh in its discipline and oddly protective in its promise of order. We have stepped into tents and palaces where women are often overlooked in official tales, shaped decisions with careful words and strategic silences. We have watched Joki, the son born into doubt, move through a family that needed him and questioned him at the same time. A living reminder that even the mightiest dynasties are built on fragile human relationships. There were darker currents too, pulled by forces no ruler could fully command. Diseases moving along the same roads as silken spices, fields left fallow or overworked as armies passed, climate shifts that quietly narrowed the margin between prosperity and disaster. All of these, in their own way, became part of the empire's story, even though Genghis Khan never issued decrees about them. Power can control armies and laws, but it cannot bargain with tiny organisms or changing skies. Most of all, we have spent time with people who never saw themselves as characters in an epic. The shopkeeper in a conquered city, the herder watching his sons ride off to serve a distant Khan, the captive artisan learning to build beauty in a place that still does not feel like home, the grandmother telling children about a village that no longer exists. Their lives were the fabric on which the empire wrote its designs. Their fears and small hopes carried the weight of decisions made in tents far away. Without them, the grand story collapses into an empty shell. Somewhere in all of this, the man at the center of the story died. We do not know exactly how. We do not know exactly where his body lies. His grave, if it is hidden in a fold of the steppe or under the course of a river, has remained stubbornly quiet. No monument announces it. No inscription explains it. In that silence he has become both more and less than he was. More because mystery invites imagination. Less because the physical proof of his presence has melted into the landscape, leaving only the consequences of his life as the true markers of his existence. Today, his name continues to shift in meaning, depending on who speaks it. For some, it is a banner of identity, a reminder of unity and endurance. For others, it is a synonym for catastrophe, a memory of homes burned and futures cut short. Historians argue, nations reinterpret. Stories are updated and revised, yet no version, however polished, can fully erase the shadows we have walked through tonight. The fear used as policy, the people turned into plunder, the laws that held everything together while keeping most subjects in the dark. As you lie here now, perhaps closer to sleep than when we began, you carry your own response to this story. It does not have to be a final verdict. It can simply be an awareness that the world you live in was shaped, in part, by choices made long ago under a very different sky. Roads, borders, cultural currents, even certain words and customs, all of these bear faint fingerprints of empires like his. Understanding that does not mean admiring or excusing the suffering they caused. It simply means recognizing that the past is not a distant, sealed-off place. It continues quietly inside us, in what we value, what we fear, and what we choose to remember. In the end, the darkest secrets behind Genghis Khan's empire may not be hidden in lost tombs or forgotten scrolls. They live in plain sight, in the way power can be both creative and destructive at the same time, and in how easily we grow used to systems that depend on someone else's pain. They remind us that every empire, ancient or modern, is built from the lives of countless ordinary people whose names we will never know. To honor them, perhaps the best we can do is what you are doing now, pausing in the hush before sleep, to look at the story without flinching, to hold both its brilliance and its cruelty in mind, and then to let the night close gently around those thoughts as the sky above and time itself go on watching in their quiet, patient way.